Meeting of the Education, Children and Young People Committee in 2025. The first item on our agenda is to take evidence on the Restraint and Seclusion in Schools Scotland Bill, and we're hearing from two panels today. Our first panel comprises of the following, and I'm pleased to welcome Dr Simon Webster, Head of Research and Policy at Enable, Kate Sanger, Family Carer and co-creator of the Communication Passport, and Susie Martin, who's joining us remotely today, External Affairs Manager at the National Autistic Society. So can I thank you all for joining us today. And Ms Sanger, can I maybe start with you and put on record, I know, what Beth Morrison has submitted in her written evidence, that she has obviously been behind the campaign for this for, I think, coming up 15 years, and very much recognising what her son Callum has been through, and they have a family trip to Disneyland, and I think we would all concur that that is important, that Callum and the family get time away, but she puts a lot of onus on you to be able to adequately articulate the cause for this campaign. And I wondered if you could maybe start off by just explaining your own background and your daughter Laura, and why this is so important to you, to Beth and so many other campaigners.
Absolutely. So, as you said, my name is Kate Sanger. I'm mum to 3 young adults. My youngest daughter was born with a rare syndrome, has a severe learning disability and complex communication disorder. And it's been 10 years and 6 months since Beth and I were in the Parliament looking for standards around restraint and seclusion. Beth's young son, as you said, had been restrained in 2010, and he was severely injured. He had over 60 bruises on his body. He was taken to the floor by 4 adults, and to this day he remains traumatised. My own daughter attended a nursery and a school for children with learning disabilities. In her primary and nursery school, she never experienced restraint or seclusion, and never ever knew what it was to be restrained or locked away in a place away from others. However, on the first day of her secondary school, which appeared to have a culture of restraint, she was restrained and isolated on the very first day at school. And this really affected her because several months into her school years, she would scream every time she seen the uniform. She didn't have much vocalisation and verbal skills then, so that was her way of telling me that she was terrified to go to school. And this persisted. And this was a journey for her throughout her years in secondary school, to be continually isolated and to be continually restrained. And to this day, she suffers the trauma from that. So Mrs Morrison and I got together, and we realised that there were many families out there, and we set up, well, Mrs Morrison set up a group called SHAME, which means Scotland's Hidden Abuse Must End. Now, this group was to give parents and professionals a place where they could come and chat freely without judgment, or, they felt easy to tell their stories. And we heard from many parents. Over 600 parents had experienced similar stuff to that we had experienced. And the only reason why they knew their children were being restrained was they were coming home with bruises and cuts. They were never informed. It was always the injuries that sparked off the knowledge that their child was being restrained. And the stories that we heard were really frightening, and the pictures that we seen were worse. We actually shared the pictures with the Scottish Government, Mr Swinney, and the education staff. We took the pictures and we showed them. They weren't pleasant. They were really quite upsetting pictures, and everybody agreed that this should not be happening today in our schools. And, the type of injuries we're talking about are severe bruising, broken teeth, burst lips, dislocated elbow, bleeding and broken nose, and just recently a 6-year-old non-verbal child was taken to the floor by 2 adults, and she sustained a broken collarbone. The list goes on, too many injuries to mention, but the reason for this is really frightening, because we all hear that restraint should be the last resort. It's not happening. It's happening as a first approach in many instances. And I don't blame the teachers, because sometimes the teachers feel that this is the only way to deal with this. They've never been given the knowledge or the skills that there are proactive and much more they could do before you resort to restraining a child. And this is where the importance of training must come in. The reasons for these restraints were non-compliance The children making poor choices, sensory overload, bad language, screaming. Some of our children just scream because of the syndromes. They don't have language skills, they don't have verbal skills, so screaming is a way of communicating their needs. Parents know what these screams mean, and that's why I did the passport, so that the teachers and the staff would have that information about what a vocalisation your child might be making and what it does it mean. Now, all these children came to school to be nurtured and learn new skills and experience happiness. And there is nothing, absolutely nothing therapeutic about restraint. We have overwhelming evidence to show that all it does is damage children. And these children are getting damaged at a very young age, the age of 4 or 5, go on to be damaged teenagers and damaged adults. And we're setting them up for failure and costing a lot of money on the route to supporting these children. Now, I understand for a very small portion restraint might be needed. My daughter is one of those children that you may have to restrain her to safeguard her life, and that's fine. And that's what we call the last resort. When it's to safeguard someone from serious injury or someone else from serious injury. But sadly, this is not what's happening. We're finding that it is getting used as a first approach. In 2025, the year, we had about 259 families applied to come and join the group. But what's worrying me is in 1 month, since the schools went back in August, we've actually had 81 families in 1 month contact us and showing us the pictures and the horror stories yet again of restraint. And I just feel that, you know, having a learning disability, being autistic, being neurodiverse, you know, it shouldn't be a barrier to getting their human rights upheld. You know, I want my daughter's human rights upheld the same as everyone else's. And Scotland has this opportunity now through Daniel's bill to lead the way in making Scotland truly a safe and a good place for children with disabilities to grow up and feel safe and feel nurtured. And I hope we move forward and take this as an opportunity to lead the UK in a change that's much needed.
Thank you very much. I think that it sets us up very well for the remainder of our session today and the further evidence that we've got. Dr Webster, can I come to you next? I mean, Enable say in their briefing that this has been an issue that your own Scottish Council, which sets your campaign priorities, has identified as a top priority in recent years. The overwhelming weight of evidence from our members and others shows that without legislation, children's rights will continue to be breached. So you're very supportive of this legislation. Why has it taken us this long to get to this stage, if you and your members and campaigners have been calling for this for many years?
That's a very good question. It's not entirely clear to me why. We are talking about protection of children, in essence, within state-provided services. So it is quite surprising that it's taken so long to get to this point. And of course, we've got to this point because of the work of Kate, Beth, other campaigners, the work of Enable, the work of the Children's Commissioner. And whatever the reasons why it's taken so long, at Enable, we're just very glad to have got to this point. We're very glad that those who've experienced restraint and seclusion themselves, those who've experienced not knowing what has happened to their child as parents, have had effect and are being listened to by Parliament. And for us, there's something really important in this about understanding, as Kate was saying, that what we're talking about here is approaches to working with children and young people that will cause harm. Even when done with good intent, with training, we have to assume that restraint and seclusion can cause lasting damage to children and young people, including many children with disabilities. So that's why we are so pleased that Daniel Johnson has brought forward this bill, which the committee, thank you, is considering carefully, which reflects the sorts of asks that Enable's membership has made through research we've conducted and reported on, particularly in 2022 with the In Safe Hands campaign. Sorry, that was the follow-up to the 2019 campaign. The measures in the bill as proposed, the need for training for our register of trainers, the need for monitoring for that degree of transparency to you as Parliament for democratic accountability, that expectation of standardisation, they're all vitally important. But the broader context is that, Enable, we do believe that we need to work towards the elimination of the use of restraint and seclusion in schools.
So ultimately you believe there would be no circumstances, because I think the vast majority of respondents say it should be available as a last resort. Are you saying it should be excluded completely?
It may be that we don't quite get to the position where it can be, but working towards that, in our view, is very important. And we recognise that, reflecting what Kate had contributed there, that the circumstances in which we find ourselves here, and in particular in which education staff find themselves, where they feel and actually have no alternative at times, and also there are instances where interventions take place, perhaps even to save lives. Those circumstances exist, and those circumstances exist at least in part because of the need for much more investment in inclusive education in all its forms. More staff, more training, of course, smaller class sizes, all of that. The context in which this is taking place, this overuse of restraint and seclusion, from our perspective, is one where teaching staff and others are under extreme stress and are trying to work with children and young people who are experiencing extreme distress in a system which requires more investment. And until it has that, we'll continue to have conditions which lead to distress and in which staff do struggle to support those children and young people to work in their environments and to work in the circumstances that they're in schools. But it does all come back to children, largely with disabilities, who are at risk of serious long-term physical and psychological harm through practices of restraint and seclusion, which at present are unregulated, which I don't think we would accept in any other sphere of society or any other public service.
Okay, thank you. Ms Martin, can I come to you, particularly in those figures that Ms Sanger gave us during her opening remarks, 81 families since schools went back in a month, contacting them with concerns. Are these the types of numbers you as the National Autistic Society are hearing from your members? I mean, is this the level of the problem that we're facing in Scotland at the moment?
Yeah, first of all, thanks to the committee for inviting us to give evidence on this really important and emotive topic. Yes, we do hear regularly from families about the restrictive practice that their children are at the receiving end of in schools. We know that it is happening frequently, and that often when it is done, it's being done inappropriately and in unsafe ways. However, I would say that with regards to knowing the scale of this problem, we don't have the data. While we hear from families, and while Kate and Beth hear from families, and while there has been great work done by the Children and Young People's Commissioner and Enable to establish how much of a problem this is, it is still largely an invisible problem. And that's why it's really important that we start collecting that data. Otherwise, it will continue to be an invisible problem, and children and young people's human rights will continue to be violated, in particular autistic children and young people and children and young people with learning disabilities and other disabilities. And I think the Children and Young People's Commissioner has already said this, but schools are at increasing risk of legal action over this issue, and we certainly are hearing more and more cases of restrictive practice being used in schools. And we would entirely agree with Enable and what Simon has just said, that in our view, the increasing use of such practices is symptomatic of an education system that is not inclusive of children and young people's support needs. In particular, we would say autistic children and young people's support needs. To achieve that inclusive system, we need the right physical environments to learn in for children and young people. We need the right training in place, and we need increased specialism within all settings, but in particular within mainstream settings. But for this particular issue, it's also really, really important that there is a legal framework in place to protect children and young people, and it is entirely unacceptable that that is not currently the case. So we are very supportive of the bill. We're supportive of statutory guidance, mandatory reporting and monitoring, and a regulated training landscape. And we really hope the Scottish Government and the Parliament will support this bill. Just a quick note on language before I pass back over to you, Convener. I'm going to refer to restrictive practice throughout this evidence session. I'm aware the bill refers to restraint and seclusion. Restrictive practice will be used by myself not to minimise this very serious harm that is caused by restraint and seclusion and restrictive practices, but to ensure we're capturing all forms of restraint and seclusion, some of which are maybe perceived to be not as serious, but actually do have a very lasting traumatic effect, particularly on autistic children and young people.
And sorry, just on that point, is that terminology you think should be changed if the bill progresses?
I think the bill as written with regards to the definitions of restraint and seclusion in the draft bill are sufficient. However, when we're talking about it, I will refer to restrictive practice, because restraint and seclusion, I think, brings to mind very serious instances. However, we're happy with the definitions within the bill.
Okay. Final question from me before I pass over to Ross Greer, who's going to ask the next questions. I'm a parent of two boys, one in primary 2, one in nursery. When they trip and fall, we immediately get a phone call, you get a note when you're picking them up, you have a word with the nursery teacher or the classroom teacher. I can't get it in my head how, for very minimal distress or injury, sometimes you can barely see it, we are informed fully. Yet, with restraint and seclusion, that's not happening. How can that be if schools already know they have to inform parents of the most minor incidents? They're not doing it for your children, Ms. Sanger.
Yeah, this is unbelievable, that a child comes home after being restrained and perhaps sustained a bump in the head, and we're not told. Now, we would need to monitor our child to make sure that they didn't develop a hemorrhage or something during the night that could prove fatal, and we're not told. I cannot believe that this is happening, but it is happening. And the only way that the families knew were the bruises, and they would have to then backtrack. So it's a safeguarding issue, and I don't know how we've got away with it for so long, that our children can be injured during restraint and were never notified. It's a very worrying issue, and thankfully this hopefully will be remedied in the bill.
But the point I'm trying to get, I just don't understand how it's happening. If I get told for the most minor incident with my sons who barely notice what happened, how you couldn't be told for something as severe as restraining a child, Callum coming home. I mean, he had blue lips, his mum had to take him straight round to hospital. How could an incident that severe not trigger a teacher or an education professional informing the parent, whereas the vast majority of parents get told of the most minor offence?
No idea. No idea why it's happened. As I say, up until now, I'm just glad that we haven't had the fatality, and very often the parents are left have to take their child to the doctors, the hospital, and sometimes we have been told that the bruises didn't happen here. So therefore, the parent is left with the feeling that they're being blamed. So this is why it's so important to notify a family as soon as this restraint has taken place, so they can safeguard their child and take them and get them the appropriate treatment should they need it. I have no idea why it hasn't happened to now. It's horrendous, quite frankly.
Dr. Webster.
As for Kate, I don't know why the research which Enable has conducted hasn't brought answers out to those questions. One survey which Enable conducted did have responses from 200 education staff at all levels on inclusive education more broadly, and raised the same sorts of concerns that we would express, and Enable appreciates that a large proportion of education professionals I would perhaps have sympathy with the general direction of the bill, but on that particular question as to why instances of restraint or seclusion, much more serious instances, as you've said, wouldn't be passed back or informed to parents. In short, we don't know why, but I think it could be an important question to ask of education professionals. There may be a cultural issue behind that, and I think it would be very important to understand the why in that, not least for implementation of any act if passed.
Okay, thank you. Ross Greer.
Excuse me. Thank you, Convener. Kate, I'd like to start with you, because you're mentioning that for a lot of teachers and school staff, they end up using restraint and seclusion because they feel that they have no other option. Now, if I picked you up right, that was, in your view, in part because they've not been trained and supported to understand what those other options are. Could you maybe expand on that a bit and just explain to us what are the other approaches that can be taken that would mean that the instances in which restraint might be inevitable can be reduced to almost zero? What is it that teachers and other school staff, support staff, are not being supported, trained to do?
Well, having spoken to the education system and teachers within it, very often when someone starts, a care assistant starts a new job, they're sent on restraint training without even understanding why a child would perhaps, someone like my daughter, who wouldn't have any verbal skills at the time, and if she was overloaded with these lights in here, she would probably hit Simon to try and escape. So for me, I would be educating the person on all the proactive things. This child has sensory issues, bright lights may affect them. So it's educating the staff to understand that the behaviours are a way of communicating something is wrong, and they use their behaviour to escape. But what's happening is the staff are being sent straight away for restraint training. So if a child comes and is anxious, the staff go to grab them because that's what they've been taught. And that's one of the things, that's why we're asking for the right training, to understand all behaviours have a message of communication. Behaviour is just an action that we all do. So it's not unusual that our children use it as their loudest voice because they have complex communication, they have no verbal skills. So in order to escape a situation they find very difficult, be it the task they're being asked to do, they don't understand what's been asked of them, so sometimes they just drop to the floor and then they're restrained, they're picked up, carried out and put in, which sometimes is just a cupboard or another area. So it's understanding behaviours, why they happen, and I think if the teachers had the right training and it would make them feel so much more happier in their job. It must be so hard for the teachers having 6 children in a class, all with special needs, all perhaps 2 children doing the same behaviour, but for 2 different reasons. That is why I did the communication passport, to give the child a voice. So that voice would inform the staff, this is why I'm doing this, and this is what you need to do to help me not to do it. But unfortunately, the training has been all wrong. They need to concentrate in training the staff to understand what behaviours are, why people would do it, and then there is a small amount of children, like my own daughter, that may need to be restrained in a difficult situation. Send those staff, that small amount of staff, for the right training so that, at this day and age, Joe Bloggs can come into our schools, set up his training, not know anything about our children, and this is very scary. This is very worrying. That's why our children are getting injured, and that's why the British Institute of Learning Disability, who we're speaking next, have created training standards so that people cannot slip through the net. And there's a lot of money. There is a massive amount of money that gets made on the backs of the misery of our children through restraint. And it's time to rectify that. It's time to put the right training in for the teachers to understand the behaviour, to support the child. It's not about changing the child, it's about changing the environment and giving the staff the right tools to work with. I mean, I hope that answers it in some way.
No, absolutely. That was really, really useful. If I could just push a little bit further, because I've sat on this committee for 9 years now, and in that period of time, really, really compelling cases have been made to us for all the things that teachers need trained in, but that they're not being trained in. A couple of times in that period, the committee's done inquiries into initial teacher education, and quite often come to the same conclusion that with the best will in the world, even in the full 4-year PGDE, rather than the 1 year, even in a full 4-year course, teachers cannot be trained in absolutely everything. So we're coming up on the point where half of all children in Scotland have some kind of additional support need. Not half have complex needs, but half have some kind of additional support need. That can vary from being exceptionally gifted to having English as a second language to the kind of complex needs that your daughter has. And some of the feedback that we get is that realistically every teacher can't be trained in everything, and what's really needed is more specialist staff in schools. So I'm just wondering, in your view, what's the balance here between trying to train every classroom teacher and every classroom assistant versus having more specialist staff on hand in every school?
I think what was missing is the human rights of our children being upheld. A lot of stuff that was needed was compassion and connection with our children and understanding the humanity of our children, and that was missing. So why would we not give the teachers the skills and the tools to do their job correctly? My eldest daughter, who's an academic, and during the summer holidays told me that she got more training how to serve a cup of coffee in Costa coffee training than that she would have got doing teacher training. That's not good enough. We have to give the teachers the right skills. Now, there is a lot of children with special educational needs. I mean, some things, it's just something as simple as working with the parent, understanding the language, understanding why the child is doing what they're doing. If we don't do this training, we're setting these children up at the age of 4 for complete failure right through the education system, and we're going to cost the government an awful lot of money. If you put the money in early and give the teachers the right training and target especially the young children, we found that the age that most children are getting restrained at is the age of 6 and 7 in our schools. It's not big children, it's the age of 6 and 7. You damage a child at that age and that child will carry that on through their adulthood. So please invest the money, please invest the training, or you're going to be spending a lot of money, and a lot of children and a lot of families are going to be damaged if we don't do it. That's really useful. Thank you.
Again, Ms Martin at this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much, Convener. Thank you for the questions, Ross. I think they're really important, and I want to touch on both of them. So what are teachers not doing to avoid situations where restrictive practice may be required? And I don't think it's a case necessarily of individual teachers, but the whole system not working to support children and young people, especially those with additional support for learning needs. Autistic children, young people, and those with learning disabilities. First of all, I just want to say, which has already been echoed by Kate, that all behaviour is communication. A little bit about autistic children, young people's experiences. They may respond with behaviour that's perceived as challenging when confronted with situations or environments they can't easily cope with. They can experience difficulty with managing unexpected changes or with processing information, including sensory information, which can cause sensory overload, dysregulation and overwhelm, which in turn can cause anxiety and often physical pain, which can result in a child or young person behaving in ways that appear challenging. And it's not always obvious to individual staff members that a child or young person is struggling until they reach that crisis point, which I think is what makes some situations very challenging. There are also situations where behaviour might be perceived as naughty because autistic children and young people are unable to follow instructions or adhere to rules and structures because of social communication differences, and that's not readily recognised. So first of all, we'd say it's more helpful to focus on identifying triggers, which is partly a lot of the work that Kate's done around communication passports and things. So identifying triggers that are causing behaviour that's perceived as challenging, but also supporting differences and ultimately recognising that behaviour is an important form of communication. And I don't think it's that individual staff members don't want to do that or don't necessarily have some, if not all of that knowledge. But there are things that could happen in schools that would make things easier for staff. Number one, increasing specialism, as I've said and you've alluded to. I don't think it's a zero-sum game on whether on the training front, and I've said this at this committee before. I don't think it's a case of, there's only specialist training and then there's only kind of, a training that gives a basic understanding. I think there's a place for both. I think we need training across the board, whether that happens at IT or PGDE level or in schools or all of that provides a basic understanding, ideally for all school staff, not just teaching staff. That doesn't need to be onerous training, but we do need a basic level of understanding of autism, of learning disabilities, of communication differences, sensory differences, and support needs. And then there's a place for specialism as well, and we absolutely need to increase that. We need to increase the number of additional support for learning teachers. We need to increase and professionalise behaviour pupil support assistants, which I know is something that you're quite passionate about, Ross. And also I just want to say very quickly that it's not always recognised that something like restraint and seclusion or restrictive practice actually can escalate further And what we want to focus on is de-escalation. And I think teaching staff and school staff don't get enough support with de-escalation. And that was our concern with the draft guidance that was shared with us in 2022, was that the focus of that was really about safe use rather than de-escalation. And I mean, like the first mention of dysregulation and sensory overload and communication needs was pages into that guidance. That's completely the wrong framing in our view. So I think there's things that can happen within the school setting, and I think that this bill plays a really important part, especially with bringing guidance on a statutory footing. And if it's framed in the right way, it could be really supportive for teaching staff in schools.
That's great. Thanks, Arch. I'm conscious of time, so if it's okay, Simon, if I could just ask you about my first question of what's the alternative. Can you kind of lay out from Enable's position what the positive alternative to restraint and exclusion is? What is it that teachers and school staff can be trained and supported to do that would avoid that?
Yes, Ross, and I'm thinking particularly of findings from Enable's 2016 research included in the main, with responses from teachers. 62% of teachers were experiencing stress and anxiety but not having the right support they felt they needed. 98% of the education workforce felt that teacher training didn't adequately prepare them for teaching young people with learning disabilities. And 86% of class teachers said there wasn't enough additional support for learning in schools. So there's work to be worked through in the detail of what's entailed in that, but I think that gives a sense of what the teaching profession themselves may be seeking in this.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you all. I'm going to find myself in a strange position where I agree with something the Convener actually said, which if you've watched any of this is quite unusual. But
between
well,
us,
I
Mr. Adams, so.
but it wasn't in connection with the Convener, right enough. But one of the... I'm at a different stage of the parenthood malarkey. I'm a grandparent now, so compared to the Convener. But like the Convener, you know, the kids get a sniffle and they're on the phone. You know, so I find it difficult as well to find that these things are going unnoticed and carrying on, and shocked because my daughter actually complains about how often the school are on the phone and sending the kids home and things like that as well. So I'd like to ask Susie, is this connected with the lack of data that you mentioned, or you said it was an invisible problem? And is this because, and how would you get that data that you're talking about in order to kind of be able to deal with the issue?
Yeah, I think we need to better understand the scale of this problem. As I say, we have a bit of an understanding from, you know, the anecdotal evidence that we have as an organisation, but also the work that Children Young People's Commissioner's done, Kate and Beth have done, and Enable have done. But yes, it is an invisible problem because there is no mandatory reporting, recording and monitoring of this issue. I don't think that addresses the why are schools reporting some things and not other things. I don't have the answer to that, but I think creating a legal framework, which this bill seeks to do, will address that problem of these instances, some of which are very, very serious, not being reported. And it's also about establishing lines of accountability. So we need individual schools to notify parents. We need those instances to be recorded by schools. We need that information to be handed to the education authorities and then also to the Scottish Government for oversight so that a report can be laid in Parliament. And our progress on eliminating restrictive practice in our schools can be closely scrutinised. And if we lift the lid on this problem, then schools will take action to prevent it from happening. And that's not to say that individual schools aren't doing that work. There are some that are doing that work, but we know that unsafe and inappropriate use is happening and will continue to happen until we start collecting the data and lift the lid on this issue, which Beth has described as a hidden shame, rightly so.
And that brings me on to some of Kate's evidence and the fact that, you know, Susie already knows this because I've cried on her shoulder about it with regard to my two autistic grandchildren. The part that you brought up about how you deal with it in a one-to-one with the teachers, it's the basic humanity, it's the basic, I've seen my daughter in these situations where the two of them are absolutely screaming the place down, and she just talks to them quietly, deals. Surely teachers do that in reality, surely, because it's as you say, it's the human thing to do.
Sadly, it doesn't happen like that. I think teachers sometimes have 2 or 3, especially in mainstream school, they may have 2 or 3 children with additional needs in their classroom, and they're overwhelmed and they just don't have that time. That's their answer, and I see it happening. They don't have that time. For me, I would have the compassion, but I don't know if everybody's born with compassion or connection, but sometimes the first thing they do is maybe make the situation 10 times worse by the way they respond, and I've seen that happen. So you've got a child that's already aroused, agitated, and the care assistant or the teacher responds in a negative way, shouts, makes the situation worse, and then it escalates. And then we have a really difficult situation on our hands. We have 3 people then carrying that child out of the room and the child getting hurt. And the situation could have been prevented in the first place by perhaps a better understanding, more support for the teacher, more support staff. But unless we have a legal framework and accountability, I think this will continue. I think by having a legal framework, at least we're giving the teachers something as well, because teachers tell me that sometimes we've got 32 councils and sometimes teachers work on the bank. They go from school to school. Different councils do different their own policies, and these teachers are struggling. So if we have a national framework, a mandatory framework, it's going to support our teachers much better as well. And I think sometimes our teachers find themselves in a very difficult way.
Okay, and that kind of brings me to the part of the my final question, but the part of the question I was going to say is there's a broad definition in the bill of what is restraint. Now, do you think that's going to cause problems? Do you think that should be kind of maybe focused a wee bit more on what it is? Because we're told that holding a child's hand while crossing the road could be, this is just some of the things that have been said, and we need to ask these questions. Using a hoist or moving equipment for children with complex needs could be taken as restraint or kind of form. So how if this isn't primary legislation, which means it is the law, how do we get the definition into such a way that everybody's comfortable, the teachers are comfortable, they know what they're doing, and everybody knows what the kind of, for want of a better word, the rules of engagement are?
This is a really difficult one, because restraint basically is making someone do something against their will or stopping them doing something. And people have said, and you're quite rightly, so in a hospital situation, my daughter would be restrained to give her to pop a drip to save her life. Yes, it's restraint, but that comes under a safeguarding. That is to safeguard her life, because she doesn't know she's so ill. She needs that drip up, so she has to be restrained to get the drip up. So I think you're right. We have to clarify the definition much clearer and perhaps give examples of what is restraint and what is not restraint. So if someone has to have postural support in a chair to be fed and make sure that they don't choke, although people might say that that's a form of restraint, that's a form of safeguarding that will be put out by an occupational therapy to ensure that that child is fed and doesn't choke. So I think we have to clarify, and the bill will do, I hope, as it proceeds, give greater clarity around those issues, because they are somewhat grey. And I should imagine Bill will talk more this morning about what restraint is and what it isn't. But it is a grey area. But for me, I only see the simple thing is if you're stopping someone doing something or making someone doing something. But if you're doing something to promote and safeguard their life, for me, it's not restraint. For me, it's a safeguarding issue.
Does anyone else get anything to add to that? Or?
Only to add that, by analogy, in previous work that Enable did, where we looked at exclusion, we found that many children and young people were being excluded in an unrecorded way. That's just to illustrate the point that it is possible, of course, to create or have a system where workarounds are possible or even encouraged. So it may well be important to have a broad definition and to work backwards from that with specific examples of what clearly is acceptable, as Kate has said.
Okay.
Come in.
Hi. Yes, thanks for the question, George, on definition. I don't think there should be room for ambiguity on this, but at the same time, I think you touch on a really important point around the challenge of defining restrictive practice, restraint and seclusion, whatever it will be called in the bill. And I just want to touch on the fact that in our view, it shouldn't just be, as I said, when I opened, those most serious instances that are covered by this bill, because we know from speaking to autistic young people that there are forms of restrictive practice that might not be perceived to be harmful, but when they're carried out on an almost daily basis are very, very harmful, and they're not supportive. And I think what Kate described is the difference between something that is supportive and enabling and then something that's done in order to, without consent and in order to restrict someone's freedom of movement, their ability to do something that they want to do, whether that's, to regulate or to be able to stay in a classroom to learn effectively. We hear of autistic children and young people who have fidget toys and, tools forcibly removed from them, where their limbs, whether it's wrists, arm, shoulder, legs, are touched or grabbed inappropriately in order to stop them stimming. We hear of autistic children, young people who are maybe not forcibly removed from a space, but are removed from a space against their will, without their consent. And I just want to read a quick quote which gives a sense of this, and maybe gives a sense of how challenging it might be for parliamentarians, but how important it is. The staff had no training or real understanding of autism or dyspraxia, and in his time at mainstream school, my son was taught at a desk behind the stage in the hall with very little teacher input. It was a very traumatic time for my son and myself. I couldn't even walk from one room to another without my phone in my hand, expecting the almost daily phone calls. The resentment from other parents and staff themselves is something that will never leave either of us. In our view, that's seclusion. So I think that gives a sense of the challenge, but also the importance of the definition.
Thank you.
I'll take in Jackie Dunbar on this point.
Thank you. And it's just a follow-on from what you've been saying just now, Susie. You were saying, and Kate as well, so what might be safe and enabling for one child could be considered restraining for another. How do we get that right then? How do we ensure that we get it right for the child that needs it to be safe and enabled, but we get it right for the other child where it is restraint? And that's maybe a difficult question, but
no, it's a good question. And when a child is assessed by an occupational therapist, the occupational therapist may say that this child needs a particular chair to support their limbs, and that chair may have straps, and that is okay, because that is something to support that child, to enable them to have a better life, to make sure, as I said, they don't choke. But we have found that a lot of chairs have been used for children that are mobile, can run about. They've been strapped in those chairs. They're brace straps and ankle straps to keep them in the chair, to stop them from running about the classroom, to manage the classroom. Now, for me, that's a deprivation of liberty. That's a terrible thing. It happens a lot. And that's the kind of restraint that I would be extremely worried about and is going on today. But an occupational therapist will always be involved when some support has been ordered or issued for a child, and there is paperwork, and they've spoken to the family. This is why your child's going to sit in this chair. I have a chair at home for my own daughter to help her support. And families recognise that and understand that. This is for the well-being of the child. But in other cases, we're seeing children strapped in mechanical restraint that should never be, and it's happening on a daily basis. So there is a big difference.
Okay, thank you. Susie, have you got anything to add?
I think you make a really important point, and I think this is where the guidance and the training that's proposed through this bill becomes really important. I think if we have statutory guidance, and as Simon alluded to, having a broad definition and working back from that, and using the guidance as a means of ensuring that schools, education authorities and staff are aware of what is supportive and then what is unnecessary, inappropriate and unsafe restrictive practice. That's where the guidance comes into its own, I think, and also where the training becomes really important and ensuring a high standard of training. And I think with regards to training, not the list, we welcome a list of approved providers, but I think it's really important that list of approved providers of training is also an indication of quality, and perhaps where the bill could maybe be amended to be improved is introducing maybe some kind of quality training standard for that approved list of training providers. So I think that it's not a case of trying to establish that difference within the definitions, but actually utilising the guidance and the training to ensure staff, education authorities are aware of what's safe and appropriate, what is last resort, and what's unsafe, inappropriate and unnecessary.
Okay, thank you. And Simon, you indicated.
Part of your question was about the example where the same approach might be helpful for someone and helpful for someone else. Of course, that's at least in part about understanding what works for that child or young person as an individual, and every teaching professional with the opportunity to do that will, we presume, want to work to understand from the child perspective and also from the family's perspective what works for them. I have to assume from what we've heard from teaching staff and from others that the resources in a general sense aren't in place to facilitate inclusive education to that extent in a range of ways. So in terms of implementation, of course, that's going to be crucial to be able to understand and to hear, in every sense, to hear from a child or young person what works for them, what is supportive, to actually have the time and the capacity to work fully in partnership with families to understand their deep experience of what works for particular children and young people will take that additional resource. Some of the self-advocates remember themselves being held down or locked in a room at school when they were young, and of course they still carry the emotional scars from that. But one individual said, and this is a good summary of the consensus in our forums, said that restraint and seclusion in schools needs to end. The human, education and physical resources need to be in place for this to happen. So this bill, from our perspective, is an essential component of making this happen, of, in essence, doing away with the option to do things differently, very differently, in such an important arena where, as we've heard examples from parents who would expect to hear routinely in, say, a mainstream setting about perhaps small things that have happened, and this contrast with parents not hearing about really very serious things that have happened to their children. So that of course, is at least in part what this bill is about. It's about bringing consistency through duties. That this is something which requires this level of attention.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Willie Rennie.
Okay, I've supported Daniel's bill. I signed up for it. I've done a bit of work on this, particularly with Beth. But I'm going to ask some probing questions because I think it's our job to make sure we get this right. I have not heard this morning what is, in the most extreme of circumstances, acceptable restraint. So let's say a young person is uncontrolled, they're a danger to themselves. How far can you go?
Well, I'm trying to think of an instance. So if you're out walking with a group of children and the child goes to run on the road, you can restrain that child. I would hope you would restrain my daughter. So if that means holding her and sitting her down, but I would hope you'd have the appropriate training to do it. In an emergency situation, you can restrain without training because you're going to safeguard someone's life, and then you move.
Sorry to be more...
No, on you go, Willie. Yeah.
So, hold.
Hold.
How tight? For how long? When? And what position? What can you do to save that person's life?
Well, that's what the training on restraint is about, teaching you the appropriate hold.
So explain it to me, though.
So, right, so for someone like you're holding, you would have to try holding them around I would put my hand around my daughter, hold her for as tight as I can. If she was trying to get away, we may drop to the floor and we would have to sit there. But there are certain holds that are being used that should never be used. And you will hear more about them from the other candidates that are speaking. The prone restraint, I know it says in the guidance that prone restraint, which is face-down restraint, should not be used. But Beth and I are hearing from families that it's still being used.
Okay.
That's face-down.
Yeah.
Very serious.
So I know what's not good. What I want to hear about
is what's good.
What's okay. Not good, but I suppose what's okay in extreme circumstances. So you're saying holding, sitting down, and how long could that go on for?
As short as time as possible.
So, but how long?
Well, it's very difficult because you would have to be in a situation. I would deem it to be the shortest time possible for that child to be like someone like my daughter, regulate herself, to get herself back in control. Some children don't get themselves back in control, and then you may have to call for others to help you. You have to. Each situation will present something different, and that's what the training's about. There is many holds, there is many positions, but these positions and these holds have to be go through training standards, and that's what we were talking about quality assurance there. I'm worried about the training that's out there doesn't have the quality assurance, and that is where the British Institute of Learning Disability comes in, because none of their training goes through without very, very strict training.
So,
quality assurance, and you'll hear about that.
So you've heard or you've read what the EIS have said, because they're worried that if you put this on a statutory footing, that staff, teachers will just withdraw because they are fearful of stepping over a line that moves.
Well, it's a safeguarding issue. If a staff allows a young person to run on the road because they feel it's if they feel that they shouldn't restrain them, then they shouldn't be doing that job. I would hope that all training would show if a child, and this is what the last resort is, it is when someone is in danger for their life or someone else's life, or there's a serious injury. And I think common sense tells you if a child's going to run on the road, you stop them.
But it's that moment, isn't it, of the child has lost control. You think, have they really lost control? Do I step in now, or do I wait a little bit longer? And it's that moment might be a crucial moment. So that moment of hit, you're right. I mean, if it's obvious they're going to run on the road, that any teacher would do what they could to save it, because it would be clear cut. It's those moments of hesitancy that they're worried about, because they're saying, if anything puts a barrier up to them safeguarding the child for fear of being prosecuted for having an illegal, and it would be an illegal restraint, then that would be a step too far for them.
I don't think it would be illegal. Yeah, but I don't think it would be an illegal restraint when you are safeguarding someone's life. You have to think to yourself, what's going to happen if I don't restrain this child? Or what will happen if I do restrain them? If you do restrain them to safeguard their life, you're doing the right thing. If I don't restrain them and they're killed, I've done the wrong thing. You make that split decision. But
it might not be as black and white as that.
Yes. Well, I think once there'll be more clarity, I think we'll have to give absolute examples. Beth and I have always called for examples to help the staff understand what is and isn't the last resort. And I think staff need that. I think we need clear examples to help staff understand what would be and wouldn't be the last resort.
Apologies for pressing you. Susie, do you want to come in?
Hi, yeah, thanks for the question, Willie. I think, first of all, I'd say that the current situation probably already exacerbates that problem of staff hesitating and not knowing what to do, because we don't have a framework in place, because we don't have appropriate guidance in place, because we don't have appropriate training in place. So I'd say we're already in that space of individual staff members potentially being hesitant or reluctant to step in. And in my view, having a legal framework, having guidance, having approved training is more supportive for staff than an absence of all of that. So I think we can only improve the situation for individual staff members by introducing a legal framework, which this bill attempts to do, and if it is approved, will do. And I also think I just want to, on your point about, fear of legal action, this bill isn't proposing an outright ban. This bill is proposing guidance, statutory guidance, yes, but schools are already at risk of legal action on this issue. I've not heard of cases where individual staff members in schools have been. I mean, Kate might be aware of some scenarios, but I think the current situation is unacceptable, and we need a more supportive. System for staff, and that's what this bill is attempting to do. So I would rebut some of what. So
that's all. I mean, that's all very powerful arguments, and that's quite effective. But we've seen that when something moves from guidance to statutory guidance, there can be mission creep. Staff can overcompensate because it's got a legal footing. So things grow arms and legs, in other words, when that happens. Do you not see the circumstance where a staff member in a split instant, even if there's all the best training and even if there's all the right guidance, that there's a possibility that that staff member might hesitate because what's right for one child is different for another? So it's not a clear line. It's an invisible line that moves constantly about what's acceptable and what's not. Do you not see that staff members, with all the other things going on in the class, that they might just hesitate for a split second because of that mission creep?
I think that I could see a scenario where staff hesitate, yes, but I would hope, and my view is that introducing clarity will reduce hesitation rather than increase it. Because I think at the moment we're already in that space of staff not knowing what to do and how to deal with these scenarios. So I think, a more clarity and a supportive system for staff will reduce that hesitancy to intervene, and give staff actually more confidence in being able to intervene rather than the opposite.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'll take Miles Briggs in at this point.
I think this is a really important area Willie Rennie's touched upon, and I know some of the conversations I've had with Beth around this and Daniel, there is concern over, and I know Beth is very keen that the framing of the campaign isn't around this, but when we put a bill into school, you've outlined really well today children with additional support needs, complex needs, and where this shouldn't be taking place in Scotland today, but is. But we hear from teachers who want to know, and sadly we're in a situation where violent behaviour is in our schools. If a pupil comes to hit or punch them, can they hold that individual? And what's the restraint around that? Because that needs to be clarified, that needs to be recorded. It isn't, but the levels of attacks on teachers is totally unacceptable. And that's where I think we really need to see, and I think, Susie, you've outlined that guidance can provide that. But I think there is a lot of concern in the teaching community over the potential for us to say, you are not allowed to touch anybody. You've outlined in terms of grabbing someone if they're running into a road in one sense. But when you turn that round and someone physically coming to attack a teacher, what would you see as appropriate in that case? Because I think the guidance cannot be woolly in that area. We have to make sure we get this right.
So I just want to make it clear that out of all the children we had, they all had learning disabilities. They were all autistic or neurodiverse. We didn't have one neurotypical child that was restrained. So we must remember that our children come under protected characteristics. It's very if a child like my daughter is coming towards you to hit you, what I would advise is you move out the way, you allow her time to regulate herself and get herself back in control. Our children very rarely, if they come, I can't talk about children that are neurotypical. There might be a lot of aggression and violence in schools from neurotypical children. That's not what I'm here to talk about. I can only discuss children that have a learning disability, autistic or neurodiverse. And very often we suggest that you stand back, you allow that child time to calm down and cool down. Very often I've seen our children's classes can be quite small, maybe 3 or 4 in the learning disability situation. I've seen them take the other 3 children out of the classroom, take them for a walk somewhere else, and allow that child to calm down. So there are ways, if a teacher is allowing a child to come and punish them, I would have suggested the teacher move well out the way of that child. You know, I just don't want to blur the lines between neurotypical children and children with learning disabilities. Our children with learning disabilities very often do not, they're pushing you away because they're scared, they're frightened, and in pushing you away, you may get hurt, and that's why we always ask the teacher, stay well back. In my daughter's passport, it says, do not go within striking distance if Laura is agitated. So, you know, there are lots of things teachers can do to avoid being hurt by children with a learning disability.
But I think what's important is where is the self-defence element for a member of staff as well. And, you know, I'm not talking about children with additional support needs necessarily. I'm talking about teachers who are telling us a disruptive teenager being violent in school. And I think that's where we really need to be clear over what would then be acceptable and what that would look like. Because in many cases, that's not being regulated at the minute. It's purely self-defence, and it's not being recorded either. But I'm not sure kind of where you personally would then see a teacher in a school. What would you suggest to them they're able to do?
Well, all teachers should be protected in schools, regardless of who it is. But it's an area where I feel it's a different area that I'm here today to talk about. Okay. I don't know if Simon wants to talk about the teenager that's out of control, that doesn't have a learning disability, how, you know, you would deal with that.
So, Enable being Scotland's largest disability charity with a long history of working with people with learning disabilities in particular, that's also our focus, along with a range of other children and young people. And the research that Enable commissioned covered those groups of children and young people in the main. So, in short, on that specific serious issue of how should teachers be able to protect themselves from, for the sake of discussion, intentional and direct assault from perhaps an older teenager who has no disability, it is very important, but it's not something that Enable has researched on or would advise on.
Okay. Susie, is there anything you...
Yeah, I understand why you're raising the question, Miles. I think it's important to acknowledge that the 3 organisations here today are representing children and young people who have additional support for learning needs, autistic children, young people, and children and young people with learning disabilities and other complex needs. And there's a reason that that is the case, because restrictive practice disproportionately affects those children and young people. So I think we first of all need to acknowledge that actually this is happening from the data that we have and the anecdotal information we have disproportionately to that group of children. I think this is why the reporting is so important. And I think actually, again, I would see this bill as supportive of teachers in this space. So at the moment, we're in a situation because we have no formal reporting mechanism for instances of restrictive practice, restraint and seclusion. Staff are also at a disadvantage. As you say, a lot of these scenarios are just simply not being reported and recorded. And actually, when we talk about last resort, which Kate has referred to, and the draft guidance back in 2022 spoke about in our view, that was not defined well in the draft guidance. It isn't currently defined well. Last resort shouldn't refer to like the last behaviour management tool in my pocket. Last resort should refer to, you know, preventing immediate risk of harm, whether it's to that individual or another individual. And that should also mean teachers. And I think actually having, a statutory reporting and recording mechanism in place will be supportive of teachers, because it will allow them to outline the circumstances that led to the restrictive practice taking place. Whereas at the moment, we are relying on individual staff members themselves raising it and trying to get redress. We're also relying on children and young people disclosing, and a lot of those children and young people are unable to disclose, as Kate has said. So I think this bill is supportive, not just of children and young people in terms of protecting them, but also supportive for staff as well, who might be on the receiving end of potentially harmful or violent behaviour. But again, bringing it back to all behaviour is communication, and actually dealing with some of those systemic issues is very important, but we still need this legal framework in place.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Paul McLennan.
Thank you, Convener, and apologies for being late. I was stuck in an accident this morning. And thank you, panel. I suppose for me, some of the discussion has been, some of the debates probably about disabled pupils, pupils with complex needs, but also those that are care experienced. And I suppose, and just in your own thoughts around about, is the balance right in terms of what we're looking here in terms of the bill, or should there be more specific guidance on specific parts of, as I said, whether it's kids or with care experience? Now, we've probably all had casework where we've had parents talk around about this in different ways. I'm just wondering, in your own thoughts, should there be specific guidance on the different kinds of areas where seclusion or said restraint might be applicable? And Kate, I'll probably come to yourself first of all in terms of, I know you've got a particular area of expertise, but just on that particular point, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think, you know, all evidence shows that it is children with learning disabilities and autistic that are the highest proportion of children that are being restrained and secluded. And I think the data, I'm really, you know, keen for the data, because that will clarify exactly where the issues are and why it's happening. And it will give us a chance to redress. It will also give us a chance to, where maybe schools are struggling, to help that school to go in and help that school and give them extra support. But, you know, as I said, out of all the children that we've had come to us, we've never had a child without a learning disability, his family come and say, my son or daughter was restrained. It's always a family that a child has additional needs. And for me, that paints the huge picture. This is where we need to concentrate. Because it's not just the restraint happens that one day. As we've said, this is a lifelong. I speak to people who are in their 60s that remember being restrained, people with mild and moderate learning disabilities that were restrained or taken out of the classroom. They still have nightmares today about being held face down. This is a lifelong trauma. And we should be preventing that. And as I say, it costs an awful lot of money for people to have therapy, to people to be supported as they go through their life. So it is the highest proportion of people that are being restrained. I don't know, Simon, if you want to add any more to
just
that.
On that point, because I think that's really important. I remember meeting an organisation in my own constituency, and this was with parents who have children who've gone to that, and are maybe now in their 20s and 30s. And the trauma was still there in terms of that. And I think when you're talking about the need for the bill and where this kind of comes from, the trauma was still there 10, 15, 20 years later, and a lot of the parents and obviously the children themselves. So I think it's a really important point you mentioned. And
my own daughter is 33 and was restrained at school when she was in her secondary at the age of 12. And she was carried along the corridors by staff, and she was put in what people would deem as a nice room. It was a plastic room with balls in it, and it had a zip. They'd place it in it and they would observe her through the plastic window. And people would think, well, that's quite a nice place for her to go. But the trauma that it's left her with, she cannot bear. I cannot have a door closed in my house. Her bedroom door had to be removed. She has a fear of closed doors. She hates anyone being behind her. She's terrified. And she can't verbalise that. I can see it by her behaviour. She screams as the door is closed. So it leaves, you know, talking 20 years later, that trauma. Yeah. And I think we have to prevent that. You know, we're seeing it. And a lot of parents are taking their children out of school. Children with learning disabilities are being homeschooled for the very fear of the child being restrained and traumatised. And that tells us a big picture as well.
Simon, and then Susie, I'll come to yourself in a little minute, if that's okay as well.
Thank you, Paul. Your question was in part about, say, care experienced young people and the possible need for detail and guidance on different groups of children and young people. So just to come to that group of children and young people as an example, and Enable's update report on NCFANs from 2022, Enable quoted the promise, and part of the quote was that the workforce must be supported to ensure a caring, relational and trauma-informed response to challenging behaviour. And also that we must pay attention to the use of seclusion, and that it's not an acceptable part of trauma-informed care. So there may be important nuances between different groups of children and young people, but of course, when schools and staff are resourced and equipped to provide trauma-informed care, also not just in terms of training, but in terms of having enough resource to do the job that they're doing, that of course would be particularly important for care experienced children and young people, but also, very obviously, just as important for children with learning disability, young people who are autistic, but also the school community in general. So on the one hand, teaching professionals may find it helpful, may be best able to connect, for example, from their own angles with particular focus within guidance. But I think there is so much in this that really is applicable to all children and young people when we create and resource the environments that children with disabilities need in terms of sensory needs, in terms of staffing levels, in terms of staff feeling supported, in terms of staff having clarity on what they can and can't do through guidance. That isn't just beneficial in terms of reducing any need for restraint and seclusion, and it's not just beneficial in terms of a safer environment. It creates the environment that helps every child and young person learn. So yes, there may be some need and guidance for specific consideration of particular groups, but I think there is so much in this that is just for everyone really, and for all staff in those settings.
Simon, that's a good point. And Susie, I'll come to yourself as well. It's kind of got me thinking about another question, because Kate, I think you talked in a bit as well about having that level of expertise that's in the schools and the training and so on. And I think one of the questions I've probably asked is in terms of that. I'm in East Lothian, so there are a number of schools, and it's geographically quite tight area. So there's schools that have the area of expertise and where kids from all over East Lothian go to and kind of stuff. But there is teachers get more training around about that. I suppose the balance is in terms of what's provided in a local authority as against what's in each individual town, because parents will have to travel, children will have to travel, and so on in terms of that. So, Susie, I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of that, because if there is that focus, Kate, as you said, on the training, do we spread it too far, or do you try and get specific schools that maybe deal with kids, as you said, with learning disabilities in terms of that, and have that specific area of expertise until there is more training in place? But Kate, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, and Kate, I don't know if you want to come back in on that point, but Susie, just your point on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and I think I would just wholeheartedly agree with Simon that creating a legal framework and having this guidance and ensuring that there's a trauma-informed approach taken through training and within the guidance will benefit everyone. But it may be that, you know, the guidance does want to touch on some specific groups that are at higher risk. And we know that obviously children, young people who are autistic, those with learning disabilities are at higher risk. That might also include care experienced and other groups. And the bill actually does take account of that. So it does say that, you know, it may make different provision for different purposes, including different provision for different education providers or different schools. And I think that's quite important, because I think that the different scenarios that might occur in different settings, especially if it is a specialist setting compared to a mainstream setting, need to be acknowledged. And I think a lot of that comes back to the resource, not necessarily the guidance. I think the guidance should be for all children and young people, and we need to be thinking about all children and young people when we're considering this issue. But actually, it's about how individual settings are resourced and what that resource is put into in terms of specialism. There is definitely a place for increasing specialism within mainstream. We would strongly argue for that, but we also need to resource that expertise in specialism where it already exists, but it needs to be improved and bolstered in specialist schools, for example. So yeah, I think the guidance needs to be for everybody, but the resource might look different depending on different settings, and that list of training providers will be very important in terms of establishing, you know, what training provider is right for what setting as well.
Susie, thanks for that. My next question, it's okay, and Susie, you kind of answered it, and I think Willie Rennie kind of touched on this as well, was around about what's the views in government's current guidance, Scottish Government's current guidance, and what the views are on, obviously, the statutory guidance. And I think you kind of answered. I don't know if you want to add anything else. I think Willie Rennie asked that question and you talked to him about it, but I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Kate and Simon, in terms of where does the guidance sit? And I think, Susie, you answered that question in terms of where should that be sitting, but I don't know if you have anything else to add, Kate, Simon, on that particular point about the guidance and statutory guidance.
So the guidance, I was part of the group that helped with the guidance, Beth and I. there are some good things in the guidance, but there are some conflicting things and confusing things in the guidance as well. But for me, the most important thing is we had guidance back in 2017, which was about 2 pages long, and it was never implemented. And we've got guidance now that's 60 pages long, and the very fact I'm having 89 parents contact me in 1 month shows me it's not been implemented either. So that's why this legal framework is so important. I think, you know, we've had lots of discussions, and I think the time now is to recognise that non-statutory guidance is not working, and we need a legal framework. The children, the teachers, everyone needs it. And just on the trauma part, I think we forgot about the trauma for the teachers and the pupils who watch the restraint. Some pupils who witness restraint are traumatised, and I've spoken to some teachers that no longer are in the profession, perhaps retired, still are traumatised from having to have restrained pupils. So it affects quite a lot, you know, just not the individual. So the restraint guidance, some good things, some conflicting things, some confusing things, but I think it's time for a legal framework with more clarity that will help support our teachers and help support and safeguard our children, basically.
Thanks, Kate. Simon, anything else to add on that?
Just to add, I think from the perspective of enable members with learning disabilities or families, that it is really important that any and all guidance and training starts with the sorts of things that Kate and Susie have been discussing here about communication methods, about understanding sensory overload, preventing crisis, de-escalating distress. And it's very important that we don't inadvertently create an environment where restraint and seclusion is encouraged. So that would be another important dimension to include, is that it's, we don't end up in a situation where there's an expectation to use restraint and seclusion. That's not the intent.
Yeah. Point. Simon, thank you for that. Convener, thank you.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Convener, thank you very much for all the information you've given so far, but also the information you've submitted and for the passion that you've done it with. I can see the importance of this and how we have to take action as a result of a lot of what you've said today, but also the other things that I've heard in my constituency casework as well. I think it was Kate Sanger who said earlier on that accountability on this is really, really important. And I agree. And I think that there are various complaint mechanisms, or there should be various complaint mechanisms. But I wondered how accessible are those mechanisms to parents and carers, or children indeed, if they're unhappy with the use of restraint and seclusion in schools?
Well, for me and for what I'm hearing is very often when you complain that your child has been restrained, you're told, well, there's nowhere else for them to go. And sometimes when we're being asked to use chemical restraint, or use medicines to quieten our children down, and we say no, that we don't think that's the route we want to go down, we're told that perhaps then the school's not suitable for you. So parents, and that was why we set up the shame group, because parents felt they were being almost blackmailed into, if you don't like restraint, then your child has to go somewhere else. So sometimes we don't get that accountability. Sometimes parents will put up with it because they're frightened to complain, just in case their child loses a place at school. So, and for me, you know, accountability, reporting restraint is never about blaming the teachers or blaming the school. Accountability for me is learning from it. If someone's done something, if someone's restrained Laura, I put in her passport. Let's have a meeting and discuss why this happened, what we can do to prevent it happening again, because I want to help the teachers understand a better way of doing it, and I want to communicate. And I suggest the same to other parents. You know, work with the schools, try and find a way to get your message across. It's not easy. Some parents feel intimidated. Some parents can't articulate themselves for many reasons. So we don't get accountability. But for me, the recording is never about apportioning blame. It will always be about finding out where there's a problem, what we can do to help that school, and is there any other measures that we can do to support them and show them a better way than using restraint.
And you mentioned there that some parents find it difficult to make the complaint or to advocate, I suppose, on behalf of them and their young person. What would you suggest could be a solution to that?
Well, I always suggest that, first of all, you contact the school, you try and work with the school, try and get your point across. And if that doesn't happen, then they usually come to a support group, and maybe someone from a support group will act as an advocate to help them. But very often, you want to do that before a breakdown takes place. And sadly, sometimes there is a breakdown because the parents feel intimidated and frightened, and that breakdown occurs. And that's sad. I don't feel there is enough places for parents to go, and even for teachers to go. I've had teachers contact me to say that they're witnessing things they don't want to witness, but they don't know who to talk to because they feel their job is in jeopardy. Now, that shouldn't be happening. It should be open and transparent. And when it's not transparent, parents think they're hiding something. So it's all I always say, to schools, transparency. Tell us what's happening, and we will help you. But accountability is a must, but it must be not about a blame. It must be about finding another way to help and readdress it, for me anyway.
Do you think parents know where to go?
Well, they know to go to the school because that's in the policies. You're always advised to go to the school. But after that first barrier that they come across as, well, where is your child going to go? Very often they will withdraw and they won't take it any further and just leave the situation as it is.
Thank you. On Dr Webster, in the submissions that Enable have given, you've said that the complaints mechanism should be simple, clear, easily accessible, linked to national standards and oversight. Can you tell us a bit about who should provide that oversight?
Yes. Ultimately, in the bill as proposed, which we support, of course, that oversight on an annual basis with yourselves as the Scottish Parliament. And importantly, that is in the vein of looking at systemic accountability. That's not about targeting anyone, about individual teachers. I think that does begin to create a space in which there's more clarity for teaching professionals, there's more clarity for children and young people, parents. People can begin to see what the standards are across Scotland. And of course, the bill doesn't propose a change to existing complaints mechanisms as such. So processes will stand that exist at present. Of course, children, young people and parents, Enable members and others often don't get far enough, don't find the resolution that they need through complaints mechanisms. There's a sense in which, though, that's an important other topic from this bill, which will, if passed, lead to that greater degree of clarity. And but again, to come back to that point about learning, I think that's what is the intent behind this. It's to create the environment in which teachers, schools, children, young people and families are able to work more effectively together with that clarity, to be honest about the incidents that shouldn't have happened and to work through those. And that duty of candour in there is itself critically important. We see that elsewhere in public services. As Kate has said, it's that candour, it's that restoration of trust. It's that thing everybody in here would expect about a relatively minor incident for their own child. So there's almost a culture changing element in what's being brought in here. There's a sense in which this is not particularly I say honest or difficult in terms of the demands that it brings. It really is just taking guidance and put it on a statutory footing. But that's the message behind it, is that this is a standard for Scotland that needs to be applied across all settings. And when it doesn't work, we need to talk about that and we need to work it through with clarity.
And a lot of the evidence that we've got talks about an external organisation. You mentioned Parliament. Do you think there are any other bodies or organisations who should be involved in the external oversight?
I think that's a really interesting question. And just still on that Parliament point, the debate last week, the Scottish Parliament Corporate Body on future commissioners made clear that there won't be what was being termed advocacy commissioners. And I think emphasised again the importance of your role, perhaps individually as MSPs, for constituents in matters like this. So just to acknowledge that exists, and that's a very important, of course, part of resolving issues. Beyond that, Enable doesn't have any particular position. When we did call previously for, say, more scrutiny or oversight, and it would be interesting to see any further proposals on that. We see in other sectors, for example, the Care Inspectorate being very involved. We see the Mental Welfare Commission regulating deprivation of liberty. So we don't have a particular position in that, but we'd be interested and open to any suggestions.
Thank you. And finally, for Dr Webster, before I move on to Susie Martin, do you think there are triggers for escalation that should be included?
In terms of the guidance? Yes, I think that would be important. That's often central to what goes wrong, of course, in terms of the sort of situations that Kate and others have described, where it is that. It's often triggers that make matters worse, and I suppose that can be very individual. Sometimes there are commonalities. It can be environments which anyone might walk into as a teacher or a child in a school setting and just realise this isn't a pleasant place to be in terms of sensory overload, for example. And there's something in that which could be in guidance, but there's a deeper issue there about investment and the resource that we have in our education estate. But more specifically for individuals, yes, there's something very important for all children, and is exemplified in the Communication Passport, and understanding specifically what is it that will highly distress that individual child, and what are the ways of not responding to that particular child when they're distressed, for example.
Thank you. Much appreciated. And Susie Martin, in your evidence, or the National Autistic Society's evidence, you said that you supported plain English policies, that structured post-incident reviews and national reporting were important, so that we can highlight some of the patterns and enable early intervention. Who do you think should be responsible for that national reporting, and how would you link early intervention perhaps with the approach we've just discussed around kind of triggers for escalation?
So, yeah, we're very supportive of the proposals in the bill around reporting and monitoring for that accountability reason. And I think Kate made a really important point that, and it's certainly what we hear, the majority of families whose child or young person has experienced restrictive practice, they're looking to see some evidence that learning has taken place and that progress is being made. And that's what the recording and monitoring and the scrutiny by Parliament will help with. It will help to make clear to families that as a country we're taking this issue very seriously, and that we are trying to reach a point where we reduce, if not completely eliminate, the use of restrictive practice and restraint and seclusion in our schools. I would say that coming back to your initial question about how accessible are complaints mechanisms, usually when people contact us about this kind of issue, they have exhausted a lot of the options that are open to them. Usually the people that are contacting us are very capable advocates for their child and young person and have explored every option. And actually we have very limited advice to be able to give them because they have explored every route. And I think that there's a really important issue here, which Simon touched on, around sort of accountability in general for public services in Scotland. And especially when thinking about how disabled people, autistic people access those services. And I think, we were hopeful that the Human Rights Bill would clarify a lot of this for us. And obviously that has now been delayed. So I think that's why the reporting and the monitoring is so important, because while this bill doesn't seek to change any complaints mechanisms, that clarity for families is crucial and is actually what they want to see. They want to see that learning taking place. So we're really, really supportive of that. And the other thing I'd just quickly say is when families contact us, a lot of the time they are left with no option but to go down in a kind of Equality Act route in terms of taking legal action under the Equality Act for disability discrimination. And usually families do that because what happens when something like a child has been, restrained, secluded, or restrictive practice has been used is that they're so traumatized that they're forced out of education. And in addition to seeing that learning is taking place, the other really important thing for families is that their child or young person receives an education. But the only way that they can get their child or young person back into education, back into an environment that's suitable for them, back into school, whether that's some provision at home, whether that's a different school, whether that's a specialist setting, is to go down that route of disability discrimination. And that's often when families see results from education providers. And I think that's a real problem. And I think that's down to resource. And it comes back to education authorities being well resourced to provide for children and young people who have additional support for learning needs and may require a change in circumstances.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Convener, can I check, are other members intending coming in on the timing for reporting?
Well, I was going to, but if you want to, no, please do.
I'll just briefly ask. No, thank you. I meant to ask earlier, actually, when I was asking some of the other questions as well. I think the convener, when he asked the first question about, you get told if the young person's got a scrape or a scratch, pretty much the same day. What are your views, particularly Kate Sanger, on the as soon as possible within 24 hours provision for notification for parents of any incident in schools?
I think parents should be notified straight away if their child has been restrained that day, as soon as possible for the teachers to do so, because then I can monitor, or the parent can monitor the child's health when they return home, which could be a life-saving situation. I understand that they may want to have a debriefing, the teachers themselves. That can be done the next day once everything's cooled down and calmed down. I wouldn't expect everything to be written up. But regarding the child's being restrained, the family should be notified straight away.
Do other panel members have a view on that particular point? Dr Webster?
Yes, we would agree. 24 hours seems to our members like quite a long time. And immediate notification, they thought, should be the expectation, particularly when a child, for example, may need medical support or support to process something highly traumatic.
Thank you. And Susie Martin, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think as soon as possible. I think it's important to have that outside limit within legislation. We've said in our response that, however, rather than 24 hours, potentially it could be before the next school day, an acknowledgement that if an instance occurs towards the end of the school day within a 24-hour period might mean that that child is back in school before their parent or carer is notified. And we would want families to have the opportunity to talk to the child or young person ahead of the following school day to assess the psychological and physical safety of their child going back into school and making that decision about whether or not they're in a position to go back to school. So I think potentially, rather than the outside limit being 24 hours, the outside limit could be before the start of the next school day.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Camille.
That was kind of the point I was going to ask on then, Ms Martin. Does that not then mean there could be a circumstance where this happens on the last day of term before the summer holidays and a family's waiting up to 2 months before they're informed because the next school day is not until they go back in August?
Yeah, and I guess if it was written in that way within legislation, and yeah, it could be interpreted like that. So that might be one to discuss with the lawyers about how that is exactly worded on the face of the bill, so we don't end up in a situation where the whole school holiday has to pass before something is disclosed. But in effect, I guess the essence of what I'm saying is that it shouldn't take, that outside limit should account for the fact that there's a possibility that a child could go back into school without the family having been notified.
And again, this is really what I wanted to ask about, because the AHDS said that there's a risk of inadvertent breaches if in the proposed timescales should the incident occur at the end of a school week or term. My worry would be actually that's when it's more vital to get the information sooner. So we shouldn't, and there may be a reason, and we will ask education officials when they come before us. There may be some mitigation for that. I can't think of it myself, because actually at the end of a school week, surely you want that information before a child potentially goes home over the weekend and a family is unaware of what went on at school. Would the panel agree with that?
Well, for me particularly, I would, if the child has been restrained, I would want a phone call. If they couldn't write it down or if they were busy, some member of staff phones me and tells me my child's been restrained and there's a bruise or there's a bump or there's nothing, but just to keep an eye on the situation. And even worse, our children are non-verbal, and if they are being restrained and sent back into a situation where they've not been able to even, a family aware of it, and we're putting them back in and back in, the trauma that caused must be horrendous. But I would say, as a parent, I want to know as soon as possible.
Okay. Thank you. Dr Webster.
Yes, and in a context where the intent behind this legislation is to increase the partnership and trust between school and home, yes, obviously, absolutely vital that children's parents are informed as soon as possible, and that we end this unawareness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. The Scottish Government's memorandum on the bill explains that care providers, care services, have that duty to record incidents of restraint. And I thought it was interesting, the evidence which the Government provided committee suggested there was 6,263 incidents of physical restraint and 509 incidents of seclusion. That was data for 2004, published in July. And that showed a 30% reduction in care services of specifically of seclusion. And I just wondered if the panel had any evidence of what's behind that reduction, if this conversation going on nationally is helping to change children's services, and also what role the school inspectorate you would see would have in this bill. You've mentioned it would be reported to Parliament, but actually if this is going to be in schools, it would be school inspectorate who are actually formally seeing how this policy is implemented. So I just wanted to put those two questions to the panel. Simon, did you want to come in, or Kate?
Well, I'll go with the school inspector. I think the school inspector themselves needs training and understanding and asking the right questions. I feel sometimes the school inspector may come in and not ask the right questions. I think we should be asking, the school inspector should be asking, do you have to use restraint? Do you have to use the seclusion? If you have to use seclusion, where would you put the child? Where does the child go? Some of the pictures we have had for seclusion have been cupboards, and I mean cupboards with boxes piled sky high with materials, and a child has been placed in there. A child that had epilepsy was placed in there for quite a few hours, quite a few days a week. Now, if the school inspectorate had asked that question and was shown that area, they would have then said this is totally and wholly inappropriate place to put a child. So I think our school inspectorate really does need more understanding on the questions they ask around this area. I mean, I don't know if Simon wants to add anything else about a school inspectorate's role.
So, although Enable hasn't stated, for example, any view on whether a particular statutory body should have oversight, in addition to the Parliament, I think there's perhaps a general point that the level of care that we take with gathering this data is important if that requires the support of some kind of inspectorate or body. That I would think that would be for obviously Parliament to decide. But yeah, we have examples elsewhere, Care Inspectorate, Mental Welfare Commission, where we have dedicated resource to looking at the use and misuse of restraint and seclusion so that it is properly monitored and data is gathered. There's possibly also something though in longer term strategies to ensure that the measures that are taken consequent to this bill do lead to a reduction in restraint and seclusion, such as you've described. And as for the factors behind that, that hasn't come out through Enable's research. I am aware, though, of, for example, one local authority where there was a major change in terms of childcare, residential childcare, and that came about through the sorts of measures that we've been discussing in terms of implementation here. Additional resource for better estate, more support for staff, more training, having that different perspective that's trauma-informed. So clearly, there are good examples from other sectors in Scotland where we know that difference can be made, and it's not impossible for that to happen within education.
Yeah, thanks for that. Susie, did you want to come in on any of that?
Yeah, I'll just come in briefly on the inspectorate point. I don't think I've got anything to add to what Simon said about that, seeing that reduction in seclusion in other sectors. We've said in our contribution to discussions on education reform in Scotland, that we want to see more of an emphasis on additional support for learning as part of any new inspection regime within Scotland. We welcome the creation of a new independent education inspector in Scotland, but in our view, the current inspection regime does not have additional support for learning at its core, and it's not being well looked at. And I think given that over 40% of the school population is now, has an additional support for learning need. Yes, that is broad, but we need to recognise that increase. It's really important that that is part of that inspection regime. And I think the recording and reporting that this bill will introduce will be really important information for a new inspector in terms of assessing how well a school is supporting the most vulnerable children and young people within our schools.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. John Mason.
Thanks very much, Convener. Training's been mentioned quite a few times already, so if I can just build on what others have said and try and maybe pin it down a bit. I might start with you, Ms Martin, this time. If I have a secondary school in my constituency which has got a unit attached to it for autism and maybe other special needs, so the kids are spending some of their time in the unit, some of the time in the mainstream school, who needs to get training in this area? Because as we heard, I think, from Ross Greer earlier on, we can't train all the teachers in everything.
Yes, I think that's a very good question. And I think that when we bring in additional support for learning units, it's important to recognise that there are different staff working in those units. I think so at the National Autistic Society, we are fully supportive of inclusive education and the presumption to mainstream. We think it's a really important principle. However, it's not being effectively implemented at the moment. What we don't want as an organisation is to roll back to a place where we have increased segregation of children and young people who have additional support for learning needs. Obviously, ASL units and bases have been around for a very long time, since like the mid-90s, if not before. And it was a way of including children and young people with additional support needs in a mainstream environment. And I think that ideally we want to get to a place where that specialism that's required to support these children and young people is even further embedded within mainstream settings, as opposed to simply a base attached to school, although there are, places for, additional spaces for children and young people who need that. I think, as I've said already, it's not a zero-sum game when it comes to training. I think there is absolutely a place for specialism within mainstream, and we need to increase that specialism. Training that comes along with that specialism will look different to training that's provided to a classroom teacher who's not working in an ASL base. And that is right that training looks different, but there is also a place for training that provides a basic level of understanding of additional support for learning needs, in particular the needs of autistic children and young people who are, increasingly making up a larger portion of that cohort of pupils with additional support for learning needs. So in my view, it's not a zero-sum game.
Include, within that, say the school janitor and the school admin staff who just might happen to witness an incident, or would you just tell them, no, you just do not get involved, you call an appropriate teacher?
So I think we're coming back to kind of, I guess, some of the issues that Willie Rennie was trying to tease out here about how individual staff members react in individual scenarios. And it's difficult for us to comment without, knowing what an individual scenario looks like. And I think it's also important to recognise that schools will have safeguarding policies in place. So when we're thinking about instances where people are at risk of immediate harm, there should already be policies and training in place for how staff react to those scenarios in order to safeguard children and young people. So I think we just need to be mindful that, we're not necessarily starting from scratch here. And again, we also know that autistic children and young people, those with learning disabilities, are disproportionately affected by restraint and seclusion. And I think it's about appropriate training for different roles. Like I say, there's a place for that training that provides a basic level of understanding that will help to create a more inclusive educational system, that will help with staff understanding. And yes, I would include janitors, catering staff, cleaners in an ideal world within that scenario, because they are part of creating an inclusive educational environment. They need to know that all behaviour is communication. They need to understand, what the autistic experience looks like in our view. When it comes to engaging in restrictive practice, ideally we want to get to a place where that is not happening very often, and when it is happening, it's happening in a safe and appropriate way. I would say we wouldn't necessarily expect all school staff to have that expert training.
I mean, I think we're agreeing with all of that, but it's just a question of who should be getting the training. That's what I was trying to pin down. So if I come to Ms Sanger, should we maybe be more relaxed about that at this point and leave that to the guidance, or do you think we as a committee and looking at the legislation, we need to get into this, who gets trained for what?
So if we want true inclusion, we want it to be more than just the child being included in the building. I think the staff who are supporting that child in a mainstream school need those tools, need those skills, need that training to do their job effectively and go home at the end of the day feeling they've done a good job. And so I would say, yes, staff supporting any child with additional support needs or autistic should have the training and the understanding about their behaviour. And, if they're coming from a unit and spending some time in the mainstream, the staff from the unit can always participate and help in that training because they have been trained. It doesn't have to be a big outside a lot of money spent. The staff themselves will know the child and can help exchange information on what the triggers are that may start that child to become aroused or agitated.
Thanks, that's helpful. I mean, Mr Webster, that kind of brings us on to who should be doing the training, and I think it was one of the councils was arguing they should be allowed to do in-house training, which is kind of, that some staff would then train other staff. Do you think there should be a list of trainers?
Yes, from Enable's point of view, there should be a list of trainers, and that list, inclusion on that list should be determined by meeting standards, which we would presume would be set perhaps by the Scottish Government. As a kind of indicator of quality, and having a list, a maintained list, also then allows for developments. So, for example, through developments and research, we know more than we did in the past about the traumatic effects of restraint and seclusion, even when done according to training, which tells us that there may be forms of training that seemed valid in the past that we wouldn't want in the future. So that dynamic nature is very important. And, of course, simply having...
Can I just ask you on that point? I mean, governments are not known for dynamic anything. Do you think it would actually be, could it not be detrimental to have a fixed list and then new ideas don't get in?
A fixed list, a list that was set would be problematic. So it would have to be a list we would think that would be updated over time, yes. And of course, having a list should assist education providers in this task of identifying appropriate training. You had a particular point about local authority training. I think that would come down to whether it met the standards that were specified.
Okay. And Ms Sanger, I think it was suggested, maybe not yours, in your colleague's paper, that we should have a bad list, that people who are not to be doing training. Was that serious?
What I'm saying is all training should pass quality assurance, because anybody can set up a training business and come in and they can really hurt and injure our children. So people, as I said, that you'll be hearing from the British Institute of Learning Disability, they have training standards and they're quite strict. And for me, all trainers should be approved by them because that guarantees that the least restrictive training will be given, and it will be more in a proactive scheme. And it will only be those children that, like my daughter, that may need to be restrained that will receive that training and save an awful lot of money in the long run.
Mm-hmm. So is it maybe better to say, well, all the trainers have got to adhere to this standard or be passed as qualified, rather than saying this is the list of names?
Yeah, for me it's about quality assurance, definitely. I've seen so many injuries from bad training providers, so for me it has to be quality assurance that this training is fit for purpose.
Mm-hmm. And is there an idea, I mean, Bernardo's made a comment, you know, a little bit of training might be kind of actually do more harm than good because it gives people the idea, you know, I see you're shaking your head.
A little bit of bad training can do a lot of harm and more good. But when people are trained in understanding that all behaviours are a communication, not every child needs to be restrained. Very few people need to be restrained. But here's all the other things that you can do beforehand to prevent having to use restraint. And that's what the quality assurance does for me.
Mr Webster, that idea of, you know, a little bit of training actually enables people to think, oh, well, I will do restraint then. Yes. Is that a fair concern? Or?
Well, I suppose there would be a risk in saying that everyone, everywhere in the education system needs to be trained in restraint and seclusion. What this isn't about, in our understanding, would be encouraging encouraging the use of restraint and seclusion. That perspective which Kate is coming from about what you can do and what you need to do to prevent the need for the use of restraint is the primary aspect. And I think related to that, any approach which kind of put restraint first, if those approaches still exist, would be difficult.
Okay. Ms Martin, you kind of broadly in agreement with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have anything further to add. Simon and Kate have hit the nail on the head.
That's great. Thanks very much. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Just a final question from me. We've spoken a lot today about restraint. Is there anything about the seclusion element of the bill you'd want to put on record? Anything about current practice, what the bill is looking to do, particularly around seclusion, and what you would hope for in that area going forward? Dr Webster.
Not specifically about the bill, but a more general observation, just to point out, of course, that seclusion is a form of detention, and any detention without clear authority and without a defined legal framework, that rightly draws significant concern when it happens to adults. And it's important that we don't perceive that practice as less of an issue when it happens to children. Of course, their rights are equal to or stronger than those of adults who are detained or restrained in these circumstances. So it's not specifically about the bill, it's just to acknowledge how seriously that's taken in other spheres, for example, detention under mental health law.
Ms Martin.
Yeah, I think not necessarily in relation to the bill, but I think we would want to just, because as I say, we're happy with the definitions within the bill. I would go back to the quote that I gave at the start of this session to outline that in our view, seclusion should be considered quite broad, and that there are scenarios where there isn't a locked room involved, but that autistic children and young people should be considered to be secluded because they are removed from a normal learning environment. They're removed from their peers, or they're removed from teaching staff. But we believe that the definitions within the bill are broad enough to cover that.
Well, seclusion is quite serious because very often our children, to be secluded, are carried along because when they take flight or fright, they drop to the floor, and the way they get them to the area where they want to seclude them, they carry them. So they're getting restrained and then they're getting secluded. And for me, that is extremely traumatic.
Okay, can I thank you all for your evidence today and for your answers to our questions. I think that's been a very helpful start to our Stage 1 consideration of this non-government bill from Daniel Johnson. So I'm going to briefly suspend the meeting for about 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, and can I also welcome our second panel for today. And we have Sarah Leach, Director of Development, British Institute of Learning Disabilities, Nicola Cullen, Children and Young People's Commissioner, Scotland, and Ben Higgins, Chief Executive Officer, Restraint Reduction Network. Can I welcome you all? And I think most of you were here for the first panel. Maybe, Ms Cullen, can I start with you? And my question to the first panel was about why is it taking us so long to get to this point? And indeed, in your evidence, you say there have been missed opportunities by the government to do something about this in some of the government's own legislation. So why has this been an issue that has clearly had campaigners calling for change for so long? There have been opportunities for government to have made this change, but we're now looking at this stage through a non-government bill.
Well, first of all, can I just say thank you again for inviting me this morning to give evidence, and it's such an important, opportunity now to be able to put greater protections in place for children and young people across Scotland. As you'll be aware from my evidence, I fully support the bill, and I'm really grateful to Daniel Johnson for bringing the bill, and to the parents and carers and organisations who have campaigned, as you've said, convener, for many, many years to make this significant milestone. I can't answer for government on those missed opportunities. Those are questions that I'm very sure you will put to them. But my emphasis is on the opportunity presented now. It's absolutely vital that this bill is taken forward. And I'm grateful for the opportunity through the committee for that to have scrutiny and the opportunity to answer questions on that.
Do you think you could have done more, or your predecessors have done more to get the government to do something about this sooner?
So you'll have heard earlier in the evidence, and you'll be very aware that the Commissioner's Office undertook an investigation on this and reported in 2018 and made recommendations then for guidance to put in place and for there to be a much broader network of support and monitoring around about that. And then alongside the EHRC, we did approach government a number of years ago as well, considering a judicial review on the fact that guidance had not been put into place. And then members of my team were involved for a degree of time in the consideration of the non-statutory guidance. But it's been since 2019 that the previous Commissioner, and since I came into post, I continued to say that guidance had to be on a statutory footing. So I think that my office has been consistent, really consistent with our message, and hopefully throughout this morning I'll be able to tell you more about what we've been doing more recently on that as well.
Well, just given that consistency and what more you've been doing, what struck me from your evidence, there's a couple of examples where you don't take a position. And I would have thought, as the Children's Commissioner for Scotland, you would have a position on the definition of restraint or seclusion, and if all incidents of restraint and seclusion in schools should be recorded, collated and reported to the Parliament annually. Given you're the voice for children and young people, you have this important role in forming government, informing Parliament. Why would you not take a position on these quite important aspects of the bill?
So, in terms of the definition, what my position is it needs to be clear, and it has to be clear where it can and can't be used. My position is also that what we've called for is for a definition to be consistent across different sectors. So really, really important that, and again, this bill presents an opportunity for there to be consistency within education and within care and within mental health settings for children and young people. What's not in my evidence, but I wanted to talk to you today about as well, is that earlier this year I did write to His Majesty's Inspectorate of Education, Mental Welfare Commission and the Care Inspectorate and asked them to come together, to work together on that creation of a consistent definition. I had some positive responses to that, and I do believe they've started to meet to discuss that process. So what's important to me is that it's consistent, that it's clear for practitioners, and that it's absolutely crystal clear when the legal benchmark can be met that meets international human rights standards. And I think that will keep children safer, but it will also keep professionals safer as well.
Do you understand, though, why, well, I'm speaking personally here, why some politicians and maybe the public would think that the Children's Commissioner for Scotland would have an idea of a definition of restraint and seclusion?
So I think that there is... I think that I'm being clear, as clear as I hope to be.
No, because your evidence says you want a clear definition, but you quite clearly state you don't take a position on the preferred definition of restraint and seclusion. I thought you would. There might be some disagreement with it, and we can have that debate, but surely you would be able to offer your view and the Children's Commissioner's Office's view on a clear definition.
Well, in terms of definition, what is clear that it has to be used as a last resort. It has to only be used in a situation where there is the need to ensure the safety of a child or the safety of others. So I'm clear from that perspective and the fact that that's set out within UNCRC international standards. So it has to be children's rights compliant. And I think that what was really important for me to get across in the evidence is about the fact that we want that to be clear for professionals, that there are a number of organisations, we've heard from some this morning, I'm sitting alongside some today, who've got real expertise in this as well to bring to the table, you know, in shaping that up. And it's about those organisations working together to ensure that there is now clarity and it's consistent across different sectors.
Okay, could I go to Ms Leach and then Mr Higgins? Another question that I put to the first panel. Why do I, as a parent of two children in mainstream education, get a phone call as soon as there's a minor scrape on my child's knee, but parents have children restrained, secluded, who get no notification at all? Can you answer why that is happening, is continuing to happen today, and it takes legislation like this potentially to sort that out?
I can't answer why it's happening. I can guess why it might be happening because it isn't considered to be. It's not mandated. It's not considered to be as important.
But is it mandated that they must tell me that my son's tripped over in the playground and he scraped his knee?
I think in some school policies it is, but I think in general school policies it's not clear that parents have to be informed, and that's what some of the parents that come to Build and talk to us about that, and some of the parents that we know through Beth and Kate's campaign have told us that they have to take the initiative. You know, they'll find out too late. I don't know why. I think it's maybe because it's not in school policy, but maybe it's something sometimes that is custom and practice. You know, that's what's expected at schools every day. Some of those children get restrained every day, so they don't see it.
So
as
it almost becomes the norm.
They don't see it's an unusual event.
Okay.
And that's definitely what we've heard. You know, we've heard from people who haven't known for a long time that their children were actually being restrained or secluded on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. So I think it does need to be it needs to be in legislation. It needs to be really clear that that's a really important thing. If my child was still at school, I would really absolutely want to know by the time they came home what had happened to them.
Yeah.
You know, it's really distressing for families to think they haven't provided that support and comfort that child needed.
Yeah, particularly when we've got examples of families who clearly know something has happened but don't know what it is.
Don't know what. Yeah.
Mr Higgins.
I mean, I agree with you. It doesn't make any sense to me either. Why would that be the case? So I would want to know if my children came home from school, you know, if they have a scratch on them, I want to know why they might have fallen over. But any form of physical or psychological harm, and restraint by its nature is harmful, it is traumatic. So any form of harm, I think parents have a right to know, and they know the same day as that happens. So what I think is probably good practice a lot of the time when a child falls over and there's a scratch or a mark or a bump or a bruise, that parents are informed. Why would that not apply? And this is about an accident when they fall over, when we deliberately and intentionally hold a child potentially on the floor, potentially for some time, which could be incredibly traumatic, and we don't tell families. It doesn't make any sense at all. So, you know, I'm hugely supportive of this bill. I think it will be a really positive step. I think the guidance that came out last year was a positive step forward. This will go further and be a further step forward, and of course be statutory. But I think that is one amendment I would like to see, is that the requirement is that parents are notified the same day, so that when the child comes home distressed, and that might be a non-verbal child, that they can understand what's happened and they can empathise with their child. I think it's a critically important amendment to the bill. The only other bit I just add to that is, and I think Kate mentioned this earlier, there may be something different around recording compared to reporting to parents. That the reporting to parents has to be the same day. I mean, I just can't see how that cannot be the case. Whereas with recording, it might be that we're going to get more helpful recording if we allow that to happen by the end of the next day. Because if you're in a highly distressed state, so you're a teacher, my background, I'm a head teacher by background, you know, if you've had a very difficult day and it's been a very difficult situation and you're in a very emotive state, your recording might not be as reflective. There might not be as much learning in that. Now, restraint is harmful, but it is also a learning opportunity every time it happens. And actually, if we can let the temperature go down a bit, the next day we're going to be more reflective and more able to think, actually, we as the adults, as the teachers, as the school, have a responsibility to look at how we avoid this happening again. Otherwise, it becomes routine use of restraint, that's the bit I have a real problem with. You know, if a child runs into the road, yes, pull them out the road. We're not saying never restrain. The routine use of restraint, I think, is a concern because it's a mislearning opportunity. But I think allowing it to be the next day to do some of the recordings, we get that reflective practice in and the learning is critical. So I think it's the same day for reporting to parents and potentially the next day by which it has to be recorded.
Okay, I know we're going to delve further into both those issues, so I'll move on to other members. And first of all, Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you. Good morning, panel. I'd just like to ask you quite an open question. Under what circumstances would you see as appropriate for staff to use restraint or seclusion? You know, and going forward, I mean, and how does it compare to the current practice that's happening in Scotland just now? Ms Colleen, can I come to you first?
Of course, thank you for the question. So we're clear that restraint should only ever be used as a last resort, and it should be to keep that child safe or to keep someone else safe. And we know from evidence that that is not what has been happening. You heard earlier on that the cases that Beth and Kate have been collating, it has been where children have demonstrated some form of distress, but it hasn't reached that point where a child is actually needed to be restrained, and there could have been other tactics, preventative solutions that could have been in place there.
So how do we get into law what is last resort for one child, but wouldn't be considered last resort for another? I'm finding that a little bit difficult to understand.
I'm happy to come in on this. I mean, I think it is, having spent many years as a teacher and head teacher, I do recognise this is a really difficult area for teachers, and we need to provide clear guidance about when you do intervene and when you don't. The way we try and frame it within the Restraint Reduction Network is to link it to the Human Rights Act and really look at when you can intervene and when you can't. So clearly there is a duty of care to look after people at times. My children run into the road, I will pull them out of the road. I mentioned earlier about the learning opportunity. When you pull them out of the road, you're also wanting to teach them and make sure they'll learn not to run into the road in the future rather than just pulling them out of the road every day. So there's the learning opportunity, but clearly there's a duty of care. So we need to be clear that teachers do have that duty of care. But then we base it on a Human Rights Act about actually when is it okay to intervene as opposed to not okay. So any type of restrictive practice has got to be justified. What's the justification? Well, my child has run into the road, therefore I am going to be justified to pull them out of the road. It's got to be proportional. So I can pull them out of the road. I can't then hold them face down on the floor on the pavement. That would not be proportional. So there's a bit about justified, there's a bit about proportionality, and then there is a bit about least restrictive. What's the least restrictive kind of approach that I can use there? So it's got to be proportional and least restrictive as well as justified. And I think the more we can make that explicitly clear for teachers, it will give them something much more tangible to hold on to in terms of when we do restrain and when we don't. It's never going to be a crystal clear line, and there is going to have to be professional judgment at times. And we do find that quite often with reflective practice, you might have difference of opinions. Different teachers might think something is necessary to intervene and others might not. But we do need clearer guidance on this matter. But I think linking it to human rights and making sure we talk about proportionality and being justified and being least restrictive is incredibly important. I do worry with the term of last resort. I think it can be confusing for people. Mm-hmm. I think Kate mentioned earlier that there's a lot of support staff, especially in more specialist schools, that the first thing they're taught almost in their first week in induction is how to restrain people. And I have huge concerns around that, without any prevention. So what's the last resort is also the only tool in their toolbox and might actually be the first resort as well. So that's why I think it's more helpful talking about, it's justified, it's proportional, it's the least restrictive option. And I think that can give a much clearer guidance for people.
Nicola, you want to come back in?
Yes, please, thank you. I was just going to add that in the guidance, the non-statutory guidance at the moment, I think there is some helpful detail as well around about the importance of a child's plan. Because I think the panel touched on earlier, there are some children who may need some form of mechanical restraint, some supportive equipment that would be incorporated into their plan to support them perhaps for feeding. So these are things that they will use a form of restraint, but it is actually anticipated, it's planned for, it would have the involvement of, for example, an allied health professional. So again, I think it's been really, really clear in the guidance again about what is a type of recommended, supported by a health professional. Educationalists are trained on that as well. But one thing I wanted to just note that was missing from the non-statutory guidance is that it doesn't note explicitly that the parent or carer has also been informed and agreed with that plan as well. So I think the review that I assume would take, that's happening at the moment by government of that provides a useful opportunity as well to be clear again about how informed parents have to be about what's been used with their child. And again, I think what Ben's touched on in terms of the importance is on the recording and the monitoring and the analysis of that ongoing, because actually if any of that equipment ever tended to cause bruises or distress to the children, that's the point where that actually would have to be reported as well and reviewed. But then there are other instances where a child may have a situation where they might be causing themselves the extreme risk of harm or others, and that's where it would be like that non-plan for restraint. But there hopefully would be some indications, and that would be part of the learning process for an organisation through the training.
So is it like maybe just a little bit of change of language might be helpful as well, so that unplanned restraint procedures are in place for unplanned restraints as that matter for last resort rather than planned restraint is what Kate was going on about. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's really crucial. It's linked to the children's plan, and it's got that recommendation, and it really differentiates, where, we heard really clearly Kate as a mum saying that she's aware and she's supportive of the fact that sometimes for her child's well-being, for her child's safety, that would need to be used. So for me, it's, that importance of the child's plan is linked, but it's also essential when we talk about restraint training. It's restraint reduction training, and it absolutely emphasised preventative. What are all the steps that can be put in place on a proactive basis, both within the environment that children are working in and with the approaches that staff have and the skills that staff have to work with them to try to avoid wherever possible children having to be restrained.
Okay. Ms Leach, have you got anything else to add, or will I just hand back to the convener?
No. Well, the only thing I'd add, I suppose, is to say again that that teachers are quite often in the situation where they've been trained in restraint but not trained in prevention approaches. Or they've been tested as being competent in restraint techniques, which is a really important part of that training, but not tested as competent to use de-escalation or understand and meet children's needs beforehand. So you need to turn that back the other way up. So I think that's probably one of the reasons that people do reach for that as a first resort.
Yeah. Thank you. That's interesting.
George Adam.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to, if you're here earlier on, go down a similar route to what I did with regard to the broad definition of restraint in the bill, because, as we all know, it's primary legislation, it's going to be law, teachers and everyone are going to have to abide by it. The bill defines restraint as anything done by a member of staff of an education provider with the intention of restricting the physical movement of a child or young person. Now, this effectively captures a lot of things that they may be trying to help the young person or child, because it may be an example we heard earlier on was a child going running onto a road, or it could be using hoists or moving equipment for a child with complex healthcare needs, because that could probably come under as restraint as well, and just basically standard physical care of a child with complex needs as well. So how do we get it to a place? Because clearly there's some work that needs to be done with this, because at the end of the day, you can't have a definition as broad as that when you're dealing with this issue.
You're asking me? Yeah.
Anybody?
Yeah, okay. So I think it is really important to have a very, very clear definition that everybody understands, because otherwise people don't know when they're slipping into restraint. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that a lot of this isn't reported to parents, because staff aren't actually understanding where their practice has slipped into seclusion or even physical restraint sometimes. But the fact that you've got a clear definition, and there might be lots of practices that do meet that criteria. I think if you go back to what Ben has said, and this is the advice that we've given to all policy writers, is that if you think about, is it justifiable? this might slip into the definition of restraint, but is this restraint justifiable? Is it proportionate? And is it the least restrictive? And if you ask those 3 questions about every incident, it becomes much clearer. And that's a really important thing, I think, that you need to identify in the bill, and that needs to come through training. And then staff feel safe. They might think, actually, this is moving into a restraint, but this is the reason that this is the way, the framework that I can think about that.
Yeah, just before, I know everyone else wants to say something, but an addendum to what I've already asked is the fact that when you look at it from a lawyer's point of view, if anything like this becomes law, and anything like this ends up with a parent say that was over the top, I'm going to go to a lawyer, I'm going to talk about it. They take that broad definition, all kinds of things could happen when law is tested in a courtroom, you know, so basically it is quite concerning. Sorry, I'm just gibbering now. Nicola, if you want to add something.
No, I was just going to say that what's important though is that this is to set the legal framework and the administrative framework. It doesn't create new criminal offences. Okay, so and we absolutely believe that this will reduce the amount of restraint happening, and it will reduce the risk ultimately for practitioners to be in a situation where they either don't know what's expected of them, they haven't had the appropriate training in place, and if they do need to use a form of physical restraint, that has been able to meet that test, and therefore they are.
It is quite broad, though. It does need to be tightened, surely.
I think that is a discussion that should be continued, you know, throughout this process. But I think what it has, you know, from my perspective, the guidance has to be really clear about what is appropriate and how staff members can reassure themselves that they would meet those legal tests, but also the absolute focus on preventative approaches and the prevention from need to use restraint.
I totally agree with that, but the problem is that's going to be on the face of the bill, that definition. So that's what it becomes. Guidance, we're actually having the opposite argument that we have a lot of times in here. The stuff getting put onto the guidance, the whole idea is that, you know, from that definition, anybody, that is definitely, there needs to be some work done in that. Surely you've got to admit, Nicola, that some work needs to be done in that.
I think what's important to be clear as well is that this isn't a piece of legislation. It's not a bill that makes it illegal to use restraint on a child. You know, so this is about a bill that's about reducing restraint, putting the administrative framework in place, ensuring that parents are aware of when it's happening, ensuring that the training is appropriate that's happening and it's certified. So I think that everybody's saying there's a bit of work to be done in terms of getting clarity. But what I wouldn't be ready to say today of whether it had to be narrowed or not. But that discussion certainly, you know, a live discussion.
Okay. Ben, have you got?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd add is, I think Kate outlined earlier in terms of what, you know, restraint is when you're preventing someone doing something that they want to do or stopping them doing something, you know, as well. So we know what restraint is. The difficulty is in terms of defining it, in terms of where I think you're coming from in terms of the legal aspect of this, is a lot of this is depending on what the will of the person is that we won't always know. So I think it does make it, you know, problematic in terms of defining. I'm conscious that, you know, there's different definitions in the bill or proposed bill compared to the guidance that came out last year. One of the areas that I suppose I'm slightly struggling with is in terms of how we define restraint. You know, how broadly do we define restraint? Because at the moment, restraint is just physical restraint within the bill. Whereas quite often within the Restraint Reduction Network, we would talk about restraint, and that is, you know, stopping you doing something that you want to do, or, you know, but that could be through physical restraint. It could be through mechanical restraint. It could be through chemical restraint. It could be through environmental restraint like seclusion. They're all types of restraint. And are we going to get into a confusion of saying that restraint is just physical? So there is a difference, I suppose. I think the guidance that was published last year talks about, you know, physical restraint and environmental restraint and mechanical, and the different types of
Ben, from what
restraint.
you've all said, makes a lot more sense to me than what the actual bill says, because the bill says effectively any education provided with an intention of restricting the physical movement of a child or a young person. That's it. You know, but you're saying that, well, you're physically stopping them from doing something they want to do. Possibly that kind of gives a better explanation than what's there.
Yes, I think it's arguably better. I think the challenge is it is difficult because we won't always know what the person's will is. So I think that then where you have to come to this part about, well, is it justified? Is it proportional? Is it the least restrictive? So the two things have to link together. This is what it is, and this is when you can and can't use it. So we're not saying, and I think as this was we're not saying you can never ever restrain, and I don't think we can say that, but we are saying you need to consider very carefully to make sure it's legal.
Okay, thank you.
Paul McLennan.
Thank you, Convener. I want to ask a little bit about the definition of a child, and I think it's probably taken, the Bill's definition is from the Education Scotland Act 1980, and it's not the same definition as is in the UNCRC. And others, the Commission and others suggest that the Bill should mirror the UNCRC. I'm just wondering what the practical or legal impact of having different definitions is in terms of that. And the second question, probably just at the same time as well, and we kind of touched on it as well. I think, Nicola, I'll come to yourself first, is on about statutory guidance rather than non-statutory guidance, and again, just on in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of that. So a couple of questions here.
Thank you. So thank you for that question. You'll see from our evidence that we've picked up that the bill refers to the 1980 Act. And in doing so, it excludes the 16 and 17-year-olds, and that's the key elements. That definition doesn't make it within compatible with the UNCRC. It's an easy fix. So we've been in touch with Daniel Johnson's team, and again, my team are happy to support with this if it's helpful. We believe that the definitions can be lifted, and rather than referring to that Act, they can be put in the bill, on the face of the bill, and that would be a very straightforward way, we believe, to be able to ensure that that's compliant with the UNCRC, and that's really important. And if it's not compliant, it means that children aren't able to legally enforce their rights. So it's a really important one that I'm really hoping that will be taken forward. In terms of the non-statutory versus statutory, I think that this has been consistent concerns for years. So you've heard from the really compelling evidence from families that children are not getting the same protections in different parts of Scotland at the moment. I looked at the submissions to the consultation, and I was particularly taken with the submission from the Association for the Directors of Education for Scotland, and they support the bill being put onto a statutory footing. And these are key officers who are tasked with ensuring consistency and appliance across Scotland within our education settings. And I think that's really compelling that they are actually saying this being on a statutory footing will help them to get that consistency. And we believe it will increase protection for children and young people, and it will ensure that all children and young people across Scotland have the same protections in the law for them.
Thanks, Nicola. Ben, I'll probably come to yourself just on the 2 points again, one about the guidance, two, and obviously about the UNCRC definition.
Well, I think you've articulated it very well, that I think if we, as I've said, when we justify the use, I think it's easiest to do that based on the Human Rights Act, and therefore taking definitions from that, I think, would create that synergy, and therefore I think it's much easier to implement. So I do completely recognise the challenges, as we mentioned earlier. It's a difficult situation for teachers, and we need to provide clear guidance for teachers about when to intervene and when to not, and when not to. So there is this bit, as I mentioned, around making sure things are justified, they're proportional, they're the least restrictive. But clearly the definitions are going to be equally important on that. But I think it is really, really important to hold in mind, we're not saying that all restraint is a never event. We need to be very clear about what restraint is. And it is when we are preventing someone doing something that they want to do, or making them do something that they don't want to do. That is what restraint is in that broadest definition. And then we're getting into potentially different types of restraint.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Sarah?
I've got nothing else to add. I think they've covered that.
Convener, thank you.
Thank you. And just slightly away from this bill, but on the UNCRC point that Paul McLennan was asking about there, we are scrutinising a government bill which has similar problems. Maybe to Nicola Cullen, should there be better guidance? Why are we now having numerous pieces of legislation coming forward? I think your colleague who spoke to us a couple of weeks ago said it was the same in the housing bill, which is now going through stage 3. We've got this private non-government bill unit bill, and a government-supported promise bill as well. They're all potentially becoming unstuck for the same reason. So why do we have to make corrections later on in the process? Why is this not sorted out to begin with?
Good questions. So I think that there must be more work that needs to be done within government, potentially with the bill rating teams, the Children's Rights Department, potentially, greater promotion of that. Government, I appreciate it's a huge organisation, and I wonder if there is additional training, understanding. It's a complex bill as well, and committee will be aware of that in terms of how it's been written, the UNCRC Act, but would certainly look to see greater progress being made in terms of bills coming forward that are within scope and are compatible.
I mean, it is a complex bill, but it doesn't take consultees to our call for evidence much time to highlight that as a deficiency in this bill and in other pieces of legislation. So is there more your office could do you think, within government, or are you doing enough to raise this up the agenda, and it's incumbent on government now to listen to these concerns?
Yes, I mean, I've certainly raised it with the Cabinet Secretary. And I have raised it in meetings with the Minister for Children and Young People. And we will continue to do that in terms of just new bills coming forward, but also the audit of existing legislation that's out of scope and government's commitment to that. So it'll certainly continue to be high on our agenda.
Okay, thank you. We'll move to John Mason.
Thanks very much, Convener. I unwisely volunteered to ask questions that no one else wanted to ask, so I've got things kind of dotted around. Clearly, we have responsibility to kids and especially young people with special needs. We also have a responsibility, though, to the staff who are employees of either a council or ourselves indirectly or so on. And the NASUWT talk about taking into account the duty of care to all in the school community by ensuring rights are not viewed exclusively through the lens of the child, who may be the subject of an intervention. Do you think we're getting the balance right in all of this between our duties to an employee, a teacher who might be subject to physical threat, and the rights of the child? Ms Leach?
Yes, I do, because I think good quality training and good quality recording is good for everybody. I think, at the moment we're in situations where education staff don't know quite what the right thing to do is, but are being taught one thing and will use that, but still don't know if they've done the right thing. We know that the impact of restraint is quite severe as well on people that apply it, as well as on those people that receive it and their families. So we have some situations probably in education settings and other settings that we know about where you have traumatised staff, essentially restraining traumatised children, and that's not good for anybody. Some good, when we saw the introduction of mandatory training standards in health, those staff that had been through good quality certified training and had learnt about other ways to work with people, that really meant they were less likely to use restraint, and therefore it was better for everybody. So actually, shoulders are going down. There's less incidents of restraint about. People are feeling more safe in their work environments, and they'd be able to do the job that they're going to work to do, which is essentially, help children to learn and thrive. And there's no way that any of this is thinking that teachers are bad people. Like, teachers don't go into work every day to restrain children. I don't think anyone is doing that. What they want to do and what they want to know how to do and be supported to do is not restrain children and make sure that those children are happy and thriving, in classrooms where they can learn. So I think it's better for everybody. But I think we do need to recognise that balance, and I think it's really good that you mentioned that's continually being brought up, because we don't want teachers to feel they're being punished by this. It's not the right way.
No, that's a helpful comment. Ms Glynn, same kind of view on that?
Absolutely. Restraint reduction, which is what this bill is fundamentally about, is good for everyone. And you've heard this morning already how it's been disproportionately used on children who have got disabilities, non-verbal children who can't speak out for themselves, and the lack of notification and understanding, which leaves a lack of learning to understand how that, how not just the child, but the professionals could be better supported as well. So I see this bill as an essential protection for children and young people, but as an additional protection for professionals that are working in that space.
Okay, Mr Higgins as well.
Well, I think it's absolutely right that we are thinking of everybody here. It's about children, it's about teachers and staff. We've got to look at everybody across the board. So I'm very pleased that that was the view from the unions, and I've spoken to a number of the different teaching unions about this issue. And obviously their primary role is focusing on teachers and keeping teachers safe. But I think sometimes there's work to do in terms of helping people understand that actually, as Nicholas just mentioned, you're focusing on restraint reduction. We're trying to prevent people getting distressed in the first place, which ultimately will keep everybody safer. What we're not saying is you can't ever restrain, and you just need, if a child's highly distressed and they end up attacking you, you can't do it. No one's saying that. And I think it is misunderstood sometimes, and we need to be really clear around this. So, when we talk about restraint reduction, what's that mean? Well, restraint reduction is really a culture change programme. We know there's lots of brilliant schools out there with really positive cultures that are really focused on, the well-being of young people and having nurturing conversations, and they have minimal reliance on restrictive practices. There are other schools out there that don't have the benefit of that really positive culture, and they have a more toxic culture, and it's actually a highly punitive approach that goes on, and there is an over-reliance on restrictive practices. So what we're trying to do, I suppose, through this bill and through any work on reducing restrictions, or whether it is about getting better training, is trying to prevent the need to restrain in the first place. It's not about how to restrain better or anything else. It's about preventing the need for restrictive practices. And ultimately, that is about how do we better meet young people's needs to prevent them becoming distressed wherever possible. So it is trying to minimise distress. So I think it's absolutely right that we're thinking about everybody's rights. I think it's also absolutely right that with the term violence sometimes does come up. And violence can also be both ways. The experience of teachers is sometimes that they might find there's a violent incident from children. The experience of children sometimes being restrained is that there's a violent incident from staff. And we mustn't lose that voice either. So it is about everybody. But I believe this is what the bill's doing. It is about trying to make sure, we prevent people becoming distressed in the first place. We minimise the need for restrictive practices, but we're not putting a blanket ban in place.
So you mentioned training as part of that, and that kind of leads on to my next one, because we spent a lot of time in the first panel, as you possibly heard, on training, and most members actually raised it. There was the suggestion that, a little bit of training could actually do more harm than good, because then everybody finds out, oh, I know how to restrain people, and therefore they jump in and do it. What's your kind of view on training as a whole? Is there bad training out there happening as well as good training?
I believe so. I think personally, I find it remarkable that you have a situation where you can teach people to hold a child on the floor against their will when they're highly distressed, which can cause physical and psychological harm. People do die through restraint as well. This does happen. It's an incredibly dangerous thing to teach people, but there's no mandatory quality assurance around it. That can't make any sense at all. There has to be quality assurance. So I think for me, this is another kind of key area of the bill that, I think it's section 5, that focuses on training. And clearly there probably needs to be a bit more in there. But the quality assurance is the kind of key mechanism. And I suppose it's a question of how far government want to go in the bill on this. But essentially, there has to be quality assurance of that training. But I think we're also confusing an issue about different types of training. So I think there's a danger just thinking about training in restrictive practices. If you go in and you teach staff, and I've mentioned this earlier on, if you've got new support staff or teaching assistants and the first thing they're taught is restrictive practices, it's the only tool in their toolbox and they're likely to use it. And you probably will see restraint go up, not down. Mm-hmm. But good training should not be focusing on restraint and restrictive practices. It should be focusing on prevention. It should be focusing on human rights. It should be focusing on hearing from people with lived experience, whether that is Beth or Kate or children, about actually how distressing this can be. And actually sometimes that's lifelong distress. And the first time I was taught restraint training, which was back in the last century, but I never had the benefit of hearing that from a young person of actually how distressed, and that would change my practice, to have actually heard that. So one of the things we tried to do with these training standards, and a background to the training standards, was the Royal College of Nursing looked at this issue, I think just soon after the turn of the century, and sort of voted on it. And it was one of their sort of strongest votes. I think it had 98% of their members saying we need to have quality assurance of restraint training. It's really dangerous. There needs to be quality assurance, and we need to move the focus to prevention. 10 years later, there was still nothing in place, and that's why in the end we thought, well, we need to set something. Someone's got to do something, and we, and got that set up.
I think it's in your submission that you use the term training needs analysis.
Yep.
Can you just explain what you mean by that?
Absolutely. So the training needs analysis is an absolutely critical part of the training standards, and it does two different things. So you mentioned who's trained and what training, and it does exactly that. So any school or any large institution, in fact, that you go into, different people will need different levels of training. And equally, so it's about who needs what, essentially. So the way the training standards work is, it starts at the basis of prevention to begin with. It then builds up to look at sort of de-escalation and then how you can sort of break away before you get into the highly restrictive techniques. So people should only be taught those restrictive techniques if absolutely necessary. The vast majority of people in the vast majority of schools do not need training in restraint. The training needs analysis makes sure we're only teaching that where absolutely necessary.
So the janitor and the admin staff wouldn't be getting...
No, but they probably should have some training in terms of things. They might not need to do prevention in the same way either, because a lot of that might be down to the classroom and things we get in place in the classroom. But they might come across a child who is distressed, who goes past them, so they might need some skills around de-escalation. So the training needs analysis really tries to look at, across all of the staff working in the school, who needs what, but we make sure only the people who absolutely need the restraint training, which hopefully in a lot of schools will be no one, but only the people who really need it need those. And even those people who do need it, it's looking at the techniques, because some people it might just be a sort of two-person escort to escort someone, to a different, safer place if they're in, it's like such as taking them out of the road.
And that's going to vary for every single school, isn't it? Because some are mainstream with a unit, some are special needs.
Exactly. So that's one of the things that's done through the training standards and certifying trainings, that when you go into the school, you sit down with that school and work out who does need what. It's bespoke to that particular setting, who has what training, rather than, and I think this happened I think I'm right in saying in Northern Ireland, they commissioned one particular training provider to sort of do the training across the board, but actually you then end up with a sort of blanket training approach where everybody gets the same training, and suddenly you might be teaching people floor techniques that they should never be using. So the training needs analysis about making sure training is proportional to the needs of the population.
Okay, that's fair.
So it's about what we train and who gets what training.
Okay, I mean, I think we could probably go on all day on this, but it's really interesting. Ms Leach, did you want to add anything on that?
Just to reinforce that the introduction of a training needs analysis before people could commission restraint training was probably one of the most significant cultural changes in the industry that's been described as the Wild West. We were hearing before that about schools that were and other settings that were employing security guards and karate teachers to come in and teach restraint on children, and that's not a situation that we really would like to think about.
Would it be the head teacher that would carry out this training needs analysis?
Yeah, with the head teacher probably in partnership with the person that they're commissioning the training from, and that has been a success of the RRN training standards, I would say, this development of joint working rather than this let's buy something off the shelf and hope it meets our needs.
Okay, thanks. Ms Colleen, on this point?
Nothing to add. I think we've covered it really fully.
That's okay. Well, that takes me on to my third area, which was about, which you've already mentioned, I think, having different regimes in schools from other children's services, and should it be more joined up? So I suppose I'm asking you, should this bill not just be covering schools, should it be covering care homes and children's care services and all sorts of things? Or how do we take that forward?
Yeah, I think that it's really important that this bill, it's great that it's looking specifically at education, but we also really welcome the fact that it's got independent schools within there and the grant-aided schools as well. What I think is important is that there is a shared understanding definition across the different sectors. And I touched on this earlier, Mr Mason, that's why I've contacted Mental Welfare Commission, Care Inspectorate, who are the main regulator for accommodation, care facilities and secure care, and HMIE, assuming the HMIE will have a further role as well to work on that.
Because a child in a school is in a slightly different setting from a child in the home, care home, children's care home, whatever, that they're staying in. Can you always just make the rules for the two the same?
Well, I think when we come back to the definitions and what you've heard, I described it as that last resort to be able to keep children safe, to be able to keep other people safe. Ben has expanded on that and touched on proportionality of that. Those things can be the same, and we really believe that children don't live their whole lives in one setting. So we have children who might be in school during the day and they might go to a care home in the evening. So it's really important for those children that there are consistent standards, there are consistent understandings, and there is consistent practice. And I see this bill and the opportunity within it for those sectors to work together on a consistent definition as a real opportunity to take Scotland closer to that.
So we get this bill through and then that maybe kind of spills out into the other sectors?
So there are opportunities already in terms of the work that the Mental Welfare Commission do and the Code of Practice with Scottish Government to get that updated from a mental health perspective. And Care Inspectorate already have standards in place, so I think there's opportunity to get this bill through, but ensure that in doing so, that those conversations are happening to get consistency across the piece.
Okay, thanks. Ms Leach, anything to add on that? No, Mr Higgins?
Just one brief comment. I mean, I think it is right. It is focused around education, but I think exactly as you've mentioned, Nicola, it's those guiding principles that I think need to apply across the board. So, you know, I have been head teacher of a school that is a children's home as well, and it is confusing when you end up with different regulations according to a time of day or which setting you're in, etc. Is confusing and unhelpful for people. I think it goes back to this point of the more consistent we can be about definitions, the less, it reduces confusion for staff. But it is those core principles and linking things to the Human Rights Act, I think, is probably the clearest way to do it. And certainly that guiding principle about when to restrain and when not to, I think that legal principle can be the same across both. But I think this bill being education specific does make sense.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much. This is a wee bit more background detail, really, and it's mostly guided towards yourself, Nicola, I think, actually. Following...
Sorry, can we just get Mr Kidd's microphone?
Sorry, I think you've all heard what I said there, actually. Just specifically to yourself, Nicola. Your Commissioner's Office report in 2018 led to the Government agreeing to develop specific guidance on restraint and seclusion, but that was delayed by the pandemic, didn't come out until November 2024. Can you give a brief narrative, if possible, on how the agreement with the Government came about in the first place and the process leading to the publication of the guidance when it did come out last year?
So certainly, Mr Kidd, I can update you on my understanding. There's probably more detail within my team who were there and working through it, so I can follow up with anything if that's useful. In terms of I think I touched on this briefly earlier, that the publication of the investigation had a number of recommendations, but my understanding is that there wasn't movement on that towards the non-statutory guidance. And that's when my office and the EHRC had considered a judicial review with Scottish Government regarding the failure to not publish the non-statutory guidance. And at that point, Government had committed to some undertakings. And part of that was the creation of the non-statutory guidance. But again, we didn't anticipate that would take so many years to be in place as well. And again, that's why the office has consistently been in touch with Government over this and trying to push. But again, I think it became quite clear early on that non-statutory guidance wasn't going to be enabled for the consistency to be put in place. And that's why the previous Commissioner, from 2019 onwards, really strongly articulated that, believed that it had to be on a statutory footing. And I think it was really compelling hearing from Kate earlier about the volume of parents who've been in touch even since August this year, as that continual evidence that this consistency of application isn't there yet.
Thank you for that. And do you believe then that the delays, etc., and the issues about working through what has been produced by your office in the first place has led to the need for this bill to be coming forward? Otherwise, something that I think you said you were hoping most of that would have been progressed already, but hasn't been.
I think that this bill's come forward because it wasn't ever on a statutory footing. Right. I think this bill is about addressing the fact that this is so important in terms of the safeguards and protections for children and young people, that it should be on a statutory footing to ensure that consistency of application and to address the regular monitoring of the data, the notification of families. This is about, as we've all touched on, ultimately it's about reducing the use of restraint. And reducing the reducive restraint strategies are about all those different parts. It's about having the strength of the framework in place, but it's also about having the data, the monitoring, the learning, the notification, the involvement of the different parties and the leadership. So I see this as an opportunity through the bill actually to send a really strong message from Parliament in terms of the leadership of the expectation around about how our children should be kept safe, but also that support across the board for children, young people and professionals about what needs to be in place to ensure that they all understand what's expected of them, and as we've all talked about, how to prevent the need for restraint wherever possible.
And that is talking basically about specific guidance on restraint and seclusion, rather than a sort of a fairly airy-fairy, well, this would be a good idea. This is actually sort of putting it hard and fast down so that it can really be developed across the country.
Yes, I mean, it's about the statutory guidance putting the legal framework and the administrative framework in place. And it also responds to one of the 2023 concluding observations. So that, was clear. UN committee called for, all UK governments to develop statutory guidance on the use of restraint on children to ensure it's only used as a measure of last resort. So the message, I think there's many voices saying that this is the right thing to do, and children really need those protections to be in place.
Well, thank you. I think it's great that the Children's Commissioner office has actually sort of been so strongly involved and kept at it over that period of time. Does anybody else want to put anything else in? No, Sarah? No, Ben? Well, look, that was very helpful. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Miles Briggs.
Thank you. I want to return to line of questioning I did in the first panel in relation to the reporting of incidents and national reporting and why that's important. And we've touched upon the value of data already, and in the previous panel I touched upon some of the data which care services are now having to report. So just wanted to ask where you think that will make a difference. And Ben, you had touched earlier on chemical restraint. I don't think there's any proposals around the recording of that, and some of the conversations we had earlier with Kate mentioning that, I think was quite important. We maybe get some understanding of what that could look like as well. So maybe bring you in first, Ben.
Certainly. So, well, I mentioned there's different types of restrictive practice, all of which I think it's vital to record. So obviously this does cover the physical restraint, it does cover seclusion, which I think is hugely, hugely important. I guess mechanical restraint is another area which is used in schools and does need to be recorded, and so I think it is vital that we do cover that. I think chemical restraint is normally, there are certainly a lot of children in schools who are on different kind of cocktails of medication, which ultimately can be restricted. But usually that is covered by, that's administered by a psychiatrist or someone else who's prescribed that medication. So it's not the school themselves that are doing that. It's different, say, in a mental health institution where there may be sort of injections and emergency. So I don't necessarily think that the chemical side is something that the bill needs to kind of consider, but it was more the point that I think there is restraint and there are different types of restraint, but certainly physical, environmental and mechanical are all, there are schools where there is no reliance of each of those.
Yeah. Nicola, did you want to go?
I guess just touching on recording and monitoring, just to expand that a little bit, I think it's really important that we are clear that it should be ongoing. Recording should be happening as soon as possible, but the monitoring should be ongoing. And I think that there's different levels of that. So we would expect that education authorities would be aware when restraint has happened within an education setting that they're responsible for, and that they would be reviewing why that's happened. But we touched on earlier the fact that there would be reporting to Scottish Government at national level, and that would be available for Parliament to scrutinise. But I also think there is a potential role here for HMIE. So it's mentioned in the non-statutory guidance that HMIE would already have a role in its inspection within the inspection of education authorities. But HMIE has recently reintroduced as an inspection of local authorities. So I think there is a natural opportunity there to ensure that there is a very thorough look at, paperwork that's recorded, have reviews happened at an HMIE level as well. And I think that it's touched on as well whether independent schools and grant-aided schools, whether they would report to the local authority or whether that may be better, sitting either with Scottish Government or HMIE to collate that data and monitor there.
Yeah. Sarah, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Well, just to say that at the kind of level that recording is made, we need to make sure that's not too onerous. And there are some really good systems because obviously people are busy, but there's certain key principles of information that is useful for restraint reduction and also useful for monitoring well-being of children. And that's also, it links into having a very clear definition. So I think you can be quite prescribed about what people need to record so that they can give, you know, and that's part of training as well. So people, it's not taking a long time. It's just I'm getting those key bits of information that are really important and will help to think about how we might avoid that in the future on a individual level, on a setting level and on a bigger level. So.
Just to come in on that quickly in terms of so we've mentioned already the importance of informing families the same day, of recording in that reflection and learning in terms of how we work with that young person in the future to make sure we change our approach. There's obviously the bit I think that sort of Nicola's mentioned is actually we need to make sure that information is used by the school effectively so that they are looking at how they can reduce reliance on restrictive practices. And we talk a lot about the 6 core strategies of restraint reduction, which has a sort of international evidence base, and part of that's about leadership, part of it is about sort of involving people with lived experience, part of that is about that reflection and learning post-incident, but data is another kind of key area. So we need to make sure it's proportional, we're only recording the data we need, but without making it excessive. But I go back to I think what the first question was of well, why haven't we got this already? This bill, this guidance, this statutory guidance, and I think a big part of that is because we don't have the recording and reporting. It's a sort of we got stuck in that cycle a bit. But so clearly there is a bit about reporting to parents. Clearly there's a bit about recording the incidents that we can learn from it. But for me there is that national bit, which I think you mentioned in the question. That yes, we need national data on this so we can see how we're doing. But I would personally argue, and this does happen in some areas, such as mental health in at least 2 of the nations in the UK, where we actually publish the information. Why can't it be public so that we can see how different areas are doing? So you can see the trajectory that people are on. Are they reducing reliance on restrictive practice, or is it increasing? So when the inspectorate go in and they can see actually it's increasing, and well, they can challenge that and they can drill in and look at that as a line of inquiry.
Yeah. Nicola.
I was just going to add that again. I think that this is an area where Care Inspectorate would be a helpful, addition. I know that they've suggested in their submission as well around about that additional scrutiny level. And my understanding is that as organisations must report to the Care Inspectorate when an incident of restraint has happened, and they have a database that is live and monitors that every day, and if they see any red flags as well, they're able to act quickly. So I think that it just shows the importance that's placed on this within another sector, and I believe that importance should be placed on this. Also to reinforce, though, we really do believe that incidents should be as few as possible.
Yeah. So, this bill is specifically around restraint and seclusion. To go back to John Mason's point, that there is no national guidance in Scotland around how to keep children safe. And I think, what's interesting, I think just earlier this month in England, the Department for Education have published statutory guidance for schools and colleges on this very issue, keeping children safe in education, 2025, the documents are called. So would you support a similar approach in Scotland for teachers to then have, that wider set of statutory guidance?
I think what's interesting about the discussion about the restraint is that the prevention, de-escalation, the strategies. The panel earlier also touched on the gap between some professionals within our education settings understanding of additional support needs or the needs of the children and young people that they are working with. So I definitely feel as if there is a lot more work to be done between the gap of how well children are supported, but also professionals within education are supported to enable them to meet the needs of all the children that they're working with. But I also believe that this bill and what's been promoted within this, the emphasis on prevention, the emphasis on de-escalation, the emphasis on understanding how different needs present themselves, all of that ultimately will keep children safer as well.
Just to add to that point, that I fully support that the bill in terms of it is trying to focus much more on prevention. I think my challenge is in terms of actually how do we support teachers to do that?
Yeah.
And that's the bit that's sort of potentially missing. So I think there is a danger, as I was mentioning before, around the training, that we're thinking about training as training in teaching people restraint techniques, but there are different types of training that I think we need to consider. There's training in terms of meeting additional needs, and I know you covered in the earlier session, well, we can't expect all teachers to know everything. I was a head teacher in special schools, but obviously there are rare conditions I know very, very little about. You can't expect everyone to know everything. But I think there is more we can do in terms of training of additional needs, certainly in terms of kind of teacher training and making sure there is more consideration. And that might not be an expert in every single condition, but it is almost that culture bit I mentioned about actually how do we understand and meet needs to prevent people coming distressed, and also understand that actually when people come distressed, quite often for people with additional needs, it's because we haven't met their needs in the first place. So there's a bit about additional needs. There's a second bit around prevention and making sure that all teachers have had the benefit of training in prevention, and that includes understanding human rights and that sort of proportionality bit, and I suppose hearing from people who lived experience about how distressing restrictive practices are. And then only a very few, and only where absolutely necessary, need that training in restraint. So I think that section around training does need more work, and this is where I think the training standards have been quite sort of helpful, because they do make sure you can only have training in restrictive practices if it is demonstrated to be necessary for that particular person in that particular school. But they must have had that other training first. They must have had the training in prevention and de-escalation and everything else. So I think having a more nuanced approach to that, and actually by having that certified training, it's meeting those training standards, by default you then end up with this list. Because there is a list that can be filtered down to look at actually in Scotland and for education, these are the training providers that met that quality. So there's already a mechanism there that I think could work. How far we want to go in the bill for that is a different matter, but I think it certainly needs to mention there must be quality assurance of training. It doesn't need to say what the solution necessarily is, because that might get into the guidance, but I think we need to be clear there has to be quality assurance of this training.
Yeah, thank you.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon. Thank you for answering the questions you've had so far. Some of the questions around training that you've already had some detail on this. But I wonder, some of the evidence that we've had suggests that we need to have a sort of directory. And in fact, some people have suggested there should be a do not use list in terms of people who are providing training on this. And I've been struck by the comments that you've made on this panel about prevention and the need for training almost in prevention, and so before it gets to the restraint point, but also on the need for quality assurance. Does the panel have any views on whether or not having a directory is the important part, i.e. a register of training providers, whether oversight is more important, or whether you need to have both in order to have that oversight and protection for the level of quality assurance that you need?
To start off, this is following on probably from the previous point, and thank you. I think it's a good question. So I don't think there's any harm in having this list of approved training providers, but only if they have met a quality mark. Otherwise, what are we doing? We're creating a list of, are they good? Are they bad? What's it doing? So I think it has to have the quality assurance, and the quality assurance is the more important part than the list. By default, the quality assurance process will result in a list anyway. So that will come as secondary to having that kind of quality assurance. But there must be that quality assurance process, and there's certain kind of key principles that that would need to cover. The key principles in terms of the training standards that exist, is that focus on human rights. It is the inclusion of lived experience. It is the focus on prevention, the recognition of the kind of trauma involved for staff and for young people as well. It is the focus on that sort of positive cultures and creating that. And it is understanding that people become distressed for a reason, and that what Kate was mentioning earlier, that all behaviour is communication. As well as talking about the importance of transparency and candour, because I think one of the things we're quite concerned about, and this is where this seclusion bit comes in, and the seclusion segregation element, is a lot of schools will have people going into a room which they will call a calming room, which makes it sound like it's a kind of perfectly fine thing to do. So we go into quite a lot of schools and see children dragged and put into these rooms against their will. And the concern that I have is, obviously this is a minority of schools, but when we say to head teachers, actually, this is pretty poor practice, it's really distressing for the child, they will close the rooms and repurpose them. The concern is that a lot of people don't recognise just how poor practice this is, and you need much better sort of guidance around it. So for me, it's much more about getting good quality training that is helping teachers, and it goes back to that previous point of how do teachers know when to restrain and when not to? Well, that's all part of good quality training, and if they're not getting that, so for me, the list is secondary. You've got to get that quality assurance of training. And as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the most dangerous things we're going to teach people to do, teachers to do. It has to be quality assured.
And do you think certification would help with procuring services that were quality assured, or is there another mechanism that should or could be used?
Well, I mean, it is a mechanism that we know works. It's, it's had an independent evaluation. We've got evidence of where it has been put into statutory guidance before, where it has improved practice significantly. We have that evidence that it works. I mean, if Scottish Government want to create a different system, that's fine. I'm not saying it has to be that one, but there is a system that works. The key is that there is quality assurance, and that this training can't happen without being quality assured. And only then can you go on to some sort of to register. So the register, I mean, is helpful, but through people being certified as meeting the Restraint Reduction Network training standards, you can go and filter down if you're a head teacher trying to commission training, and bearing in mind as a head teacher, quite often your expertise is not restraint. Well, I hope your expertise isn't restraint training. It should be. But you can filter down and look, and it is helpful in terms of commissioning training which is outside your area of expertise. So there is a benefit to having a list, but much more important is having that kind of quality assurance in place. And in addition to that, making sure teacher training does have, does focus on that, meeting additional needs and sufficient focus on that, as well as recognising that restrictive practices are harmful, which also needs to be in teacher training.
Thank you. Nicola Clean, your submission speaks about the importance of effective oversight and cross-sector consistency rather than a directory. Have you got anything that you could add to your view on this?
I mean, I think that I would agree with Ben. Actually, we're less concerned about the list and more concerned that training is in the bill and that it's certified training.
Thank you. Sarah Leach, do you have a view?
The only thing to add, the other protection that I think certified training has and that we've seen is that not only is it based on a TNA, so it meets those conditions, but that if people are taught those restrictive physical intervention holds, that they're properly risk assessed for that population. That's a really important point if you think about how dangerous holding someone is, and and the amount of deaths and injuries that we've seen. So I think it's worrying otherwise.
Thank you.
One last comment on that is, I suppose, the guidance that was published last year, I think, was, as I said, a helpful step forward. This bill goes a hell of a lot further, and it's a really, really positive step forward. My worry is that element on training might end up being a step backwards, not forwards, compared to that previous guidance. Whereas actually the guidance does talk about why training should be certified and all of the benefits of that. Why would we not include that within this bill?
Thank you. And related, I guess, to training is, of course, the understanding of what is acceptable or unacceptable restraint or seclusion, if that's the right way to describe it, as we've discussed. Some evidence we've had has suggested that seclusion where the young person isn't able to leave the person they're secluded in would be unlawful. What's the panel's view on that?
Yeah, so where, the use of seclusion where a child isn't able to choose to leave the space would, be a deprivation of liberty. And that's again why we're really welcome the fact that this is a restraint and seclusion bill. And again, the importance of the guidance helping professionals to understand that, because I think, again, this is an area where we suspect that there's a huge amount of under-reporting on the use of seclusion and a lot of confusion about what can be used, because as you will have heard, and we've heard that, there can be the good use of, calming spaces and places where children and young people can use that are a part of their plan, that they have choice over, that allow them to remove themselves from a space where they're feeling sensory overload and they're feeling, upset and stressed. But it's really important and really welcome that the bill focuses on that as well.
And can I just ask on that, if if there's a circumstance where there's a worry about a young person's safety, do you think there are thresholds of authorisation that need to be required in terms of maintaining the young person in a space? Does there need to be is there a distinction between having that and also having a kind of planned, timed breaks from a place of seclusion as well?
So in terms of that planned time breaks, again, we wouldn't expect to see in a child's plan a planned timed break in a place where they didn't have the choice to leave. So again, in terms of seclusion, that is really about, is it a locked space? Can they not access the ability to move? But I think we've all touched on this morning, there are obviously emergency situations, duty of care situations that can happen. And again, I think that is always going to be the balance within professional judgment there.
Thank you.
Just to come in on the seclusion point, I think one of my concerns is I think there is confusion in quite a lot of schools around what's good practice and what's poor practice. And part of this is about transparency of language, where things get quite muddled. So there is good practice where Johnny, when Johnny's distressed, goes out of the classroom and sits on the swings because that's what Johnny's chosen. He's taken himself off there. But sometimes that gets called sort of time out or seclusion. But then you end up with a time out or seclusion room where someone is dragged and put against their will. And that it's highly distressing when people are taken to these rooms. Quite often these are rooms which don't have a toilet or access to water or anything else. So clearly it is at best borderline where it is legal. It's certainly highly, highly distressing for the young person, and it's certainly not going to make it easier to meet the person's needs going forward. So, it should only be in incredibly extreme, situations that happens. And I'd like to think in 5 years' time, we'd be looking back and thinking, what the hell are we doing? But locking children in cupboards in schools. What are we doing? I think we probably all know around this. This is not something that is good practice by any means whatsoever. So I think it is really important. It does cover seclusion, and that we do take a very sort of clear line on it. But we do need to differentiate what is, as Nicola mentioned, it's around choice and the child's choice and the child and the family, and in the sort of a support plan or care plan, it's very clear what that person needs when they're distressed, as opposed to someone being dragged against their will, which is obviously a type of restraint and restricted practice that can be incredibly harmful.
Thank you. That's helpful. Thank you, Convener.
Just on that, Mr Higgins, you're saying it's good that it's included in this bill. However, Clan Child Law state in their submission that the definition of seclusion in both the bill and the guidance specifically includes the condition that the child must not be able to leave the place that they've been isolated in. So that, if we pass this bill, we're basically endorsing that, even though everyone's saying it's a breach of the child's human rights.
Well, I think, in terms of the definition of seclusion, it's about not being able to leave. I think sometimes there is confusion in schools around it because people say, they can leave, we're just standing in the way. So it's not necessarily it's locked. It's it could be a person standing in a way, or it could even be coercion of you can't come out of here. Yeah. They're still prevented from leaving.
But does it matter if it's a physical barrier of a locked door or a person or being verbally told you're not allowed to move?
No, I don't think it does. I think there are all types of seclusion where you have a child on their own in a room with no social interaction, unable to leave. It's clearly poor practice. It's clearly a type of restraint. And it's clearly something that we need to be moving away from within schools.
So is this bill not the opportunity to move away from it? I understand restraint as a final tool to stop a child injuring themselves or others. But seclusion's not really the same if you're saying it breaches that child's human rights.
I agree. I think it's an opportunity to go further. That as I say, I would very much hope that in 5 years' time we will look back and think, what the hell are we doing with this practice?
But today, sorry, I'll come to you in a second. But today, this is happening. So what action is being taken to safeguard children's human rights then? If we all know it's happening at the moment, it's maybe being underreported, but the breach of their human rights is occurring as we sit here this morning.
Yep. So as I said, when we go into a number of schools, particularly special schools, and we do see this practice happen, not in it's in a minority of schools, but it's in too many. And we do always feed back and say to head teacher, this is poor practice. We strongly recommend you end this practice, you repurpose this room.
But a teacher could say to you, but there's a bill going through Parliament at the moment that would try to reduce it, but doesn't in any way outlaw it.
Yep. And it is one area the bill I think can go further on.
Okay. Sorry, Miss Cullen.
No, I was just going to come back to the the opportunity within the bill, I think, to ensure that professionals understand, you know, that actually what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate. So I think that we all believe that this is hugely misused and underreported. So there's the opportunity by including it within the bill to ensure that that training covers it, people actually understand what they are doing, where it's being inappropriately used, they understand the impact it has on children and young people, and if they understand that if they choose to use that it has to be reported and that there would be follow-up action, whereas at the moment I think we're all concerned that it is still happening and there isn't any, any monitoring or scrutiny of that at all.
So what are you doing as a Children's Commissioner? You know this is happening in Scotland, and you know when this is happening, it is breaching the human rights of that child. What are you doing about it?
So I guess the work to get to this point has been a huge part of what our office has done. You know, we've touched already.
And I understand all that. But you know there is a breach of multiple people's human rights every time this occurs.
So part of the issue is we don't have the data and the information to be able to know, that. So there are.
So if a parent contacted you this afternoon, maybe this session has raised awareness to say their child has been or is regularly secluded and locked away on their own, told they can't leave, what advice would you give?
Well, so I guess in the first instance, we would encourage parents and carers to go through the complaints process that to raise concerns at a local authority level, and then SPSO would be the next if they felt that the Education Authority hadn't dealt with that. But we're here today. You know, what I'm doing as Children's Commissioner is asking all of you to support, this bill and for this bill to go through Parliament.
This bill legitimises it. I think we've just agreed that this bill it's included in the definition of seclusion for this bill is the condition that a child must not be able to leave the place that they've been isolated in. So on one hand you're telling us pass this bill, but on the other hand you're telling us the seclusion element of it breaches human rights. It's currently happening and will still happen after this bill passes.
I think it's a really useful question, Convener, to be asking around about that and to continue to probe through the committee scrutiny. Because I think there could be arguments for and against. And I guess where I see the positive of including it is that it gives the opportunity now to ensure that across all authorities, across all educational institutions, that we would have a profession that actually understands what seclusion really means, and it would remove the malpractice and poor practice that we believe exists, but we don't have any of the data. It would ensure that the recording is in place. It would ensure that there was the ability to have a follow-up. But I think it's a good question to continue to explore.
Okay, thank you. Ross Greer.
No further supplements.
Nope.
Yeah, that covers it.
Okay, thank you. Then just my final point, because Mr Higgins, do you want to come back on? Yes.
Very quickly mention, I think in terms of you mentioning around seclusion in schools, I think there is potential to go further. And again, it's important to make sure we are building on the guidance that came out last year. And it does have points 73 and 74 talk about the use of seclusion in schools. So 73 does talk about seclusion is not recommended for general use in schools, either as part of routine practice or as a default response to distress behaviour. So I think we just need to make sure across the board this bill is building on going further on this issue.
Yeah. Yes, Ms Killen.
Convener, I just had one additional point, if it's not related to that.
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yep.
One thing I just wanted to raise to the committee's attention as well is the bill, I think, as drafted, has suggested at the moment that nurseries wouldn't be included. And I just wondered if committee would be able to explore that over the next few weeks, because again, it may be possible as drafted that if we get those definitions clear, that this could be applicable for nurseries. Now, my understanding is there is likely to be reasons why Daniel Johnson's team has not included that. But I do wonder whether there's an opportunity with regulations, if there is more work to be done, that there could even be a delayed implementation for nursery if there is greater complexity that has to work through. So I just wanted to raise that. We've talked a lot about getting consistency, ensuring all children have the same protections. So I wanted to bring it to your attention and ask if committee would consider exploring recording that.
I'm sure it will in our further panels and with both the Cabinet Secretary and the member in charge. My final question is just around, because Mr Higgins, you touched on this, you think the incident should be reported to the parents same day, but recorded potentially the day after to take the emotion out of it, to make sure we have the right information. So the bill as currently drafted says as soon as possible, but no later than 24 hours after the incident. Are you saying that needs to be tightened up in the bill? Because 24 hours is potentially, if it happens at the end of one school day, it's the end of the next school day and the child has gone back before then.
Yeah. So in terms of the reporting, I think it needs to be, before the staff go home that day, that the parent, so if it's at the very end of the day as the child is being picked up, obviously it's not always going to be possible to notify the parents straight away beforehand. However, before people go home that day, I think it's absolutely, it's exactly the same way as the sort of slips coming home about a graze on the knee or the phone call about the graze on the knee. That happens the same day. Why can't this? So in terms of informing parents, I think it has to be the same day. So I think it might, you need to now have sufficient time to do it. So I recognise it might not always be before the child's been collected, but it needs to be the same day. Whereas the recording, you might start the recording that day, but I think allowing till the end of the following day so that you can get that reflective practice and learning in. And I'm conscious schools are sort of busy and there's not always sort of the team to kind of cover each other. So sometimes that might be at the end of the school day that's done. So allowing till the end of the school day for the actual kind of recording side to make sure we do capture the learning.
And could I ask the panel's view on the AHDS submission that there's a risk of inadvertent breaches in the proposed timescales if the incident occurs at the end of a school week or school term, basically saying that if we then have a weekend or a number of weeks off, that may lead to breaches if we are so constrained to within 24 hours. I have some concerns about that, and I just wondered if that's shared or if they do agree with the points made by that association. Ms Colleen?
I would share your concerns, Convener, and I think, as we've heard earlier, the amount of impact trauma that can have, the ability for a parent or carer to be able to support their child is essential, particularly if that's over a weekend or into holiday periods, because a level of anxiety can also develop and there has to be the ability to support the child.
I'm seeing nods in agreement from our other panellists. Can I thank you for your time today and your evidence? That concludes our consideration of the bill today and also our public part of the proceedings, and the committee will now move into private session to consider its final agenda item, and I suspend the meeting briefly to allow our witness to leave. Thank you.